A 6-year-old boy went missing 2 weeks ago. They combed through the entire forest. They checked every ravine. They've given him up for dead. But his mother cries by the well every morning and refuses to believe it. And then a stranger in strange clothes comes to the village. He takes the boy's wooden horse. He places it on a warm bronze disc, and the disc lights up a golden dot pointing straight north. To understand who this stranger is, let's go back 2 days. Dan Marchetti opens his eyes and sees the sky. Not the ceiling of a mine, not the lights of an ambulance, the endless blue sky. He smells something. Wild roses, wet earth, cold stone beneath his back. And then it hits him. Dead people don't smell wild roses. He sits up with a jolt, and his head explodes with pain. His hands are intact. His legs are intact. He wiggles each of the 10 toes in his boots. This isn't right, because the last thing he remembers is the rope. The rope snapped at 40 meters. A 40-meter fall into a stone well. After something like that, you don't wake up in a ravine under a rose bush with your jeans and flannel shirt still intact. Dan looks at his palms. Not a scratch. Even the old callus from the hammer is still there. 3 days stubble. The scar above his eyebrow from a rock fall in Utah. It's all him, only the world around him is foreign. His leather map case lies on the ground nearby, the very one in which he carried maps of the deposits for 8 years. Dan opens it. The maps are gone. Instead, a bronze disc the size of his palm lies at the bottom, warm, unnaturally warm, as if another person had just been holding it. A compass rose is engraved on the surface. Dan flips the disc over. The back is smooth. He clenches it in his fist and closes his eyes for 3 seconds. He opens them. The ravine is still there. The sky is still there. The disc warms his palm as if it were alive. All right, Dan, breathe. Panic didn't help in the rock falls or the gas pockets. It won't help now either. He stands up. His legs hold him. And then his professional eye catches the ravine wall. Limestone. Layered. Ordovician in appearance. A river once flowed here. And right here he freezes. There's a crack in the wall 2 meters up. Only the edges are too smooth. The stone is chipped, not split. Nature doesn't make right angles. Someone has sealed an entrance here. The disc in his hand twitches. Dan looks at it. A golden dot glows on the bronze. It points directly at the sealed entrance. He doesn't know what kind of world this is. He doesn't know if he's alive or dead. But he knows one thing. Limestone remains limestone in any universe. Water erodes stone the same way everywhere. If this world follows the rules of geology, then Dan is at home here. He approaches the wall and pries the stones apart with his hands. The mortar has long since crumbled to dust. Behind the stones, a narrow passage opens up. Dark, damp. It smells of clay and metal. Dan steps inside. The floor is smooth, polished by feet. Someone walked here a very long time ago. After 20 steps, the passage widens into a chamber. Against the far wall is a stone box with its lid open. Inside, bronze coins glint dimly. Each bears the same compass rose as on the disc. Dan takes a handful, about 20. He leaves the rest. He turns and heads toward the light. At the exit, a foreign world lies before him. Hills, a road below, along which a wooden cart creeps. Dan goes down and walks. 2 hours later, he meets a peasant with a cart. They look at his jeans and boots as if they were a miracle. Dan raises his hands to show he has nothing. He takes out a coin and holds it out to the man. The man takes it. He looks at it, his eyes to his forehead. He says a few words to his wife in a foreign language and gestures for Dan to get into the cart. The cart creaks. Dan is silent and listens. The language is foreign, but not entirely. An hour later, he understands simple phrases. Another hour later, he replies with short words. as if the language had already been sitting in his head, waiting to be awakened. The village is called Tilla, 24 houses, a smithy, a well in the square. The man leads Dan to the village elder. The elder turns the coin over in his hand and asks where he's from. Dan replies that he's from far away, very far away. The village elder nods. Wanderers come and go. But this one pays in Haldorian bronze, and it's worth 3 times as much as silver. Dan is given a room at the temple. He lies there, turning a single word over in his mind, the one everyone keeps repeating. Haldor, the empire that collapsed. In the morning, he is awakened by screams. And here we are again at the well. A mother is crying. A gray-haired blacksmith with hands black from coal. Their 6-year-old son went into the forest after a goat 2 weeks ago and never returned. Dan steps out and asks if they have any of the boy's belongings. The blacksmith looks at him as if he were mad, but the mother pulls out a wooden horse. Dan places it on the disc and thinks of a single word. Where? The bronze heats up. A golden dot flashes and points north, into the forest. Dan asks for a rope and a flask. He goes alone. The disc leads the way. The dot glows steadily. Dan reads the ground beneath his feet like a map. Loam turns to clay. The clay becomes damp. Water is nearby. 2 hours later, he stops. Thick, old ivy underfoot. The dot glows straight down. Dan drops to his knees and parts the ivy with his hands. A stone lies beneath it. There's a hole under the rock. An old well, so overgrown you can't see 3 steps ahead. Dan lies on the edge and looks down. Darkness, the smell of water, and a quiet sound. Breathing. He shouts down. Silence. Then a faint child's voice. The boy is alive. For 2 weeks at the bottom, he drank water that dripped down the walls and ate moss. Dan ties a rope and climbs down. The child weighs as much as an empty backpack, skin and bones. He clings to Dan and won't let go. Dan carries him back up. When he emerges from the forest with the boy in his arms, the village falls silent. Then the blacksmith runs, falls, gets up, runs again. The mother collapses to her knees in the mud and hugs her son so tightly that Dan fears she'll break him. The blacksmith bangs his forehead against the dust at his feet. Dan steps back. He feels awkward. He's no hero. He's a geologist from Colorado who knows how to find things in the ground. That's all. They offer him money, food, a home, daughters. Dan refuses it all and asks only to sleep. At night, the village elder comes to him with bread and a mug of milk. He is silent for a long time. Then he says there is a cave in the mountains. People are afraid to go there. Goats disappear there, and a rumbling can be heard. If Dan finds children in wells, maybe he'll take a look inside. Dan smiles in the darkness. A gas pocket, an underground river, a cave-in. Any geologist would name 3 reasons, but the disc in his pocket is already warm, and a golden dot is already shining toward the mountains. Outside the window, the sky is full of stars, not a single familiar constellation, another world. But the stone beneath his feet is the same, and the earth speaks the same language, and the dead geologist from Colorado feels something resembling peace for the first time in 2 days. The morning in Tilly smelled of smoke and fresh bread. Dan stepped out of the village elder's house and squinted into the sun. The village was already awake. People were looking at him, not like yesterday. Yesterday he was a strange drifter in unfamiliar clothes. Today he was the man who had brought a dead boy back to life. The blacksmith was waiting for him on the porch. He handed Dan a bundle. Inside was a knife. Simple, sturdy, with a wooden handle. The blacksmith said it was the best he could offer. Dan took the knife and thanked him. The knife was heavy and well-balanced. The blacksmith knew his craft. Dan had breakfast at the village elder's house. Porridge, bread, goat's milk. 3 other men were sitting at the table. They looked at Dan and said nothing. The village elder explained that they were hunters from the village. They wanted to go with him to the cave. Dan said he would go alone. The hunters exchanged glances. The village elder frowned. He said it was dangerous in the cave, that 2 years ago a shepherd had gone in and never returned. Dan nodded. Then he asked what exactly the rumbling coming from the cave sounded like. Low, they told him, as if the earth were groaning. Dan suppressed a smile. The earth doesn't groan. The earth resonates. The rumbling in caves is caused by air moving through narrow passages, or water flowing through underground channels, or both. It's not a curse. It's physics. He got up from the table and went outside. The trail to the mountains began behind the last house in the village. Narrow, rocky. The climb was gentle but long. Dan walked and read the slope. The rock changed. Limestone gave way to dolomite. Dolomite meant karst cavities. Karst meant caves. Lots of caves. Entire systems of cavities washed out by water over thousands of years. After an hour of climbing, he saw the entrance. A dark opening in the rock, about 2 meters high, a meter wide. A chill emanated from it, and that same rumbling. Dan stopped at the entrance and took out the disc. The bronze heated up instantly. Several golden dots flashed on the surface at once. Bright, deep. They led into the mountain at varying depths. Dan whistled. That was a lot. Too much for a single cave. He put the disc away and went inside. The first 50 meters were easy. A wide passage, a smooth floor. The ceiling was high enough to walk upright. Moisture glistened on the walls. The air was cold and clean. No mine gas. That's good. The rumbling grew louder as he moved forward. Dan pinpointed the source after 10 minutes. An underground stream. Water was flowing somewhere below, beneath the cave floor. He could feel the vibration through the soles of his boots. The passage began to narrow. Dan ducked. Then he got down on all fours. Then he crawled through a crevice that barely let his shoulders through. Beyond the crevice lay an open space, a large one. He couldn't see the walls. He could only sense the size by the sound. The echo of his footsteps returned with a delay. That meant a large hall, very large. He took out the disc. A golden glow flooded the darkness. And Dan saw. The walls of the hall were covered in carvings. Columns hewn from the rock supported the ceiling. A stone altar stood against the far wall. Bones lay on the floor in front of it. Human bones. Many of them. A shepherd, Dan thought. The one who disappeared 2 years ago. He stepped closer. The bones were old, not 2 years old, decades old, maybe centuries. A decayed sack lay next to the bones. Coins spilled out of the sack. Not bronze like the ones he'd found in the ravine. Silver, with a different mint mark. Dan crouched down and examined the coins without touching them. A face was stamped on each one, a man's, with a crown, and an inscription in the same language as in the ravine chamber. Haldorian coins, silver. He surveyed the hall. The disc showed several dots, 1 on the altar, 2 in the walls, 1 under the floor. Dan started with the altar. An object lay on the stone surface, small, round. He wiped it with his shirt sleeve. A medallion, bronze, engraved. A compass rose in the center, surrounded by symbols he couldn't read. The disc in his hand reacted. It grew hotter than ever, and did something new. An image appeared on the disc's surface, a map, schematic, lines like on a topographic map. Dan recognized the contours. The hills around Tilla, a road, a river, and new golden dots, far to the north, to the east, to the south, dozens of dots, hundreds. The medallion on the altar was the key. He expanded the disc's range. Dan stood in the darkness of the underground hall with the medallion in one hand and the disc in the other, looking at the map that showed him a whole world full of hidden things. Things that someone had lost, things that someone had hidden, things that someone had searched for and not found. He put the medallion in his pocket. Then he examined the walls of the hall. 2 spots in the walls turned out to be niches, bricked up. Dan pried open the first one with the blacksmith's knife. Inside lay a scroll, leather, rolled into a tube and sealed with wax. He didn't unroll it. The leather was brittle. He put it in his case. The second niche was deeper. Inside stood a clay jug sealed with a lid, heavy. Dan carefully removed the lid. Gold, coins, rings, chains, all small items, all finely crafted. Someone's hiding place. Someone had come here hundreds of years ago and hidden their wealth, and never returned for it. Dan picked up the jug. It was heavy, but manageable. He decided to leave the spot under the floor for later. He didn't have the tools to break open the stone floor. He'd come back later. The return trip through the crevice, jug in hand, took 20 minutes of acrobatic maneuvering. Dan scraped his elbows and tore his shirt at the shoulder, but the jug was intact. When he emerged from the cave into the light, he sat down on a rock and caught his breath. Then he opened the jug again and examined the contents in the light. Gold rings, delicate, set with stones, chains with pendants, coins larger than those bronze ones. On one ring he saw an engraving, the same compass rose. Haldor. Everything here was Haldorian. This whole land was soaked up by the dead empire like a sponge soaks up water. Dan went down to Tilla by evening. The village elder was waiting at the outskirts. He saw the jug. He saw the scroll in the tablet. He turned pale. He asked what was there. Dan showed him the gold. The elder recoiled as if from a snake. Haldor's gold, he said. It's dangerous. If the Seekers find out, they'll come. Dan asked who the Seekers were. The village elder explained. An order under the Velgard crown. They search for Haldor relics for the king. They take everything. Those who resist are hanged. A year ago, the crown issued a decree. All relics found are subject to confiscation. The deadline is 1 year. After that, death for possession. Dan listened in silence. 1 year. He had 1 year. He asked when the decree was issued. The village elder said 3 months ago. That meant 9 months. Dan looked at the jug of gold in his hands, then at the village. The houses were old. The roofs were patched. The fence by the blacksmith's shop was crooked. Children ran barefoot. He took 3 gold rings from the jug and placed them in the village headman's palm. The headman opened his mouth. Dan said this was payment for food and lodging. And for silence. No seekers. Not a word to anyone about the cave. The headman clenched the rings in his fist and nodded. He was a practical man. Haldor's 3 gold rings were worth more than the village's entire annual harvest. That night, Dan sat in his room and thought. Before him lay the disc, the medallion, and the jug. The facts were simple. First, he was in a world where an empire had collapsed 800 years ago, and its treasures were scattered across the continent. Second, he had a tool that found these treasures. Third, people were killed for these treasures. Fourth, he has 9 months before the hunt becomes deadly. Fifth, he is alone, without weapons, without allies, without knowledge of local customs, in jeans and a torn flannel shirt. He needs clothes, a horse, supplies, a map, and someone who knows this world better than he does. In the morning, he left Tilla. The blacksmith came out to see him off. His wife brought out a bundle of food, bread, dried meat, apples. The boy stood behind his mother and looked at Dan with wide eyes. A girl stood next to him, older, about 17, covered in soot, with a hammer on her belt. She looked at Dan differently, not gratefully, greedily, not for gold, for something else. Dan nodded to her and set off down the road. The girl watched him until he disappeared behind the hill. Her name was Caitlin. Dan left the 3 gold rings with the village elder. He hid the silver coins from the cave in his tablet. He buried the jug with the rest of the gold in the forest 2 kilometers from the village and marked the spot on the disc. He walked north along the road. The disc showed the nearest town to be half a day's journey away. The road was empty. A couple of carts passed by. Once, a merchant walked by with a bundle on his back. Dan spoke to each of them. The language came more easily. The words came on their own, as if someone were slipping them into his head. He suspected it had something to do with the disc, but he had no proof. By evening, he reached the town, Kestmar, a small town behind a wooden wall. The gates were open. The guards watched the people entering lazily. Dan walked past them calmly. No one stopped him. He found the market. He bought clothes, simple ones, a linen shirt, a leather vest, pants made of thick fabric, a hooded cloak, boots, all for 3 silver coins. The merchant gasped when he saw the Haldorian silver, but said nothing. Money is money. Dan changed behind the counter. He rolled up his jeans and shirt and put them in the bag he'd bought. Then he found a stable. A horse cost 12 silver coins. He bought a chestnut mare, not very tall, sturdy, with kind eyes. He bought a saddle and bridle for the horse. Then he found an inn, paid for a room for the night. He sat in a corner of the common room with a plate of stewed meat and a mug of beer, and listened. People talked. People always talked. Tongues loosened better in taverns than during interrogations. Dan listened and memorized. The Velgard decree, the confiscation of relics. Seekers scoured the roads. 3 villages in the south had been searched down to the cellars. In one, an old man was hanged for a Haldor ring. People were afraid. But there were others, fortune hunters, vagabonds, those who'd decided to find and sell while they still could. A fever was sweeping the roads, a gold rush. Dan knew what that was like. In Colorado, it had been 150 years ago. The same faces, the same greed, the same corpses on the roadside. He finished his beer and went up to his room. He lay down on the bed. He took out the disc. It warmed his palm gently. Golden dots flickered. Even here in the city, there were several of them, under the foundations of houses, under the pavement, under the market square. This world was like a mine with a vein on every horizon, and Dan was the only one who saw the map. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. For the first time in 3 days, in a normal bed. Dan spent a week in Kestmar, not because he had nowhere else to go. He had places to go. The disc showed hundreds of directions. But Dan was a man of action. An exploration geologist doesn't rush to the first point on the map. He gathers data first, studies the terrain, plots a route. For 7 days, Dan sat in taverns and listened. He walked through the market and haggled. He went into the temple and spoke with the monks. Every evening, he returned to his room and drew a map on a blank piece of leather bought from a saddler. The map grew. 6 kingdoms, 10 free cities, mountain ranges, rivers, highways, forests. He marked down everything he heard, where the ruins of Haldor lay, where the Seekers' outposts stood, where the trade routes ran, where it was safe, where it wasn't. By the end of the week, he knew enough. The kingdom of Velgard to the east, the most aggressive. Their order of Seekers numbered 300 men. They were commanded by a captain named Cassian Vale. People spoke of him in whispers, polite, ruthless, intelligent. Anyone who fell into Cassian's hands did not escape. Not because they couldn't, because Cassian convinced them there was no need to run. To the west lay the Drevel Principality, small, mountainous. They had no time for relics. They fought their neighbors over the mountain passes. To the south stood the free cities of the coast. merchants. They didn't care whose gold it was, as long as it flowed through their hands. To the north lay the Gray Mountains, a vast range, sparsely populated, wild. Rumor had it that the richest Haldorian ruins were there, yet almost no one went there. Too dangerous. Mountain passes, landslides, glaciers, wolves. Dan smirked when he heard that. Passes and landslides were his profession. On the 8th day, he rode out of Kestmar northward along the highway. The horse walked steadily. The weather was dry. The disc was working. The first day of the journey passed quietly. Dan rode along the road among wagons and pedestrians. By evening, he stopped at a roadside inn. He spent the night there. In the morning, he rode on. By noon on the second day, the road had emptied. Wagons became scarce. The forest on either side grew denser. Dan sensed something was wrong a minute before it happened. The horse twitched its ear. A tree lay across the road ahead, freshly cut. Dan pulled on the reins and stopped. An ambush. A classic of the genre, the same in any world. He turned his head and saw them, 4 of them, coming out of the woods on the right. 2 with swords, 1 with an axe, 1 with a crossbow. Dirty, skinny, not professional bandits, desperate. That made them more dangerous. A professional weighs the risks. A hungry man with a sword doesn't calculate anything. Dan dismounted, slowly, hands in plain sight. The one with the crossbow shouted for him to drop the bag. Dan looked at him, then at the others, then at the road behind them. A 5th man lay in the ditch by the road. Not a bandit, a man, bound. Dan looked closer. Red hair, freckles, a woman. Her hands were tied behind her back. Her mouth was gagged with a rag. Her clothes were torn at the shoulder, blood on her temple. She was alive. She looked at Dan with hatred and directness. No pleading, no fear, just fury. The bandit with the crossbow shouted again. The bag, the money, the horse, everything. Dan assessed the situation. 4 armed men, 1 crossbowman at a distance. No chance in a direct fight. He was a geologist, not a warrior. But he was a geologist who had spent 8 years working in places where the earth killed more often than people did. Dan looked down at his feet. The road ran along the hillside. To the right, a forest. To the left, a cliff, dropping down to a stream. The soil at the edge of the road was eroded, clayey, wet from yesterday's rain. A crack in the ground ran along the roadside. A landslide was just waiting for a trigger. Dan raised his hands. He took a step toward the edge of the road. A second. A third. The bandits moved after him, all 4 of them, along the eroded edge. Dan leaped forward and to the side, toward the center of the road, and he stomped. Once. Hard. Right on the crack in the ground. The effect wasn't instant. 2 seconds. 3. Then the edge of the road started sliding down. Slowly, then quickly. The clay layer slid down toward the stream, along with the 2 thugs standing on it. They rolled down the slope, screaming and clinging to the grass. The 3rd managed to jump back. The 4th fired his crossbow. The bolt missed. Dan didn't wait for him to reload. He rushed to the ditch where the bound woman lay. He pulled out the blacksmith's knife. He cut the ropes on her hands. She ripped out the gag and jumped to her feet. Then she did something Dan hadn't expected. She kicked the nearest bandit in the knee. He fell. She snatched his sword. And 3 seconds later, she was standing with her back to Dan, holding the sword with both hands. The bandit with the crossbow dropped his weapon and ran into the woods. The 2 down by the stream were limping away. The one lying on the ground with a broken knee was whimpering. The woman looked at him, then at Dan, then back at the bandit. She lowered the sword. She turned fully toward Dan. Up close, she looked to be about 25. Short red hair, freckles on her nose and cheeks, 3 empty scabbards on her belt. The bandits had taken the knives. She was a hunter. Dan could tell that from her movements, from the way she stood, from the way she held the stranger's sword. She said her name was Amber Hall. Dan gave his name, Amber looked him up and down. She asked how he'd caused the roadside to collapse. Dan explained. Washed out soil. A layer of clay over the rock. Water between the layers. A crack means the stratum is ready to shift. All it takes is a vibration. Amber listened, with the expression of someone trying to figure out if they were telling the truth or making fun of her. Then she said she was on her way to Kestmar, that she'd been robbed last night. They took her horse, her weapons, her money, a bag of belongings. She was a Guth, a bounty hunter. She'd taken a contract to capture a thief on the southern road. The thief turned out to be with friends. Dan nodded. He offered to give her a ride to Kestmar. Amber looked at his horse, at him. She said it was a half-day's ride to Kestmar, and she didn't like walking. They rode together, Dan in front, Amber behind him, in silence. The first hour passed in silence. Then Amber spoke up. She asked where he was going. North. Why? On business. What kind? My own, Amber snorted. Then she said the northern route was dangerous. Bandits were nothing. Further on, there would be villages where outsiders weren't welcome. And further on, the Seekers' patrols. They check every traveler, looking for relics. Dan asked if she worked for the Seekers. Amber fell silent. Then she said no, but she knows people who did. They drove on. At the fork in the road, Amber was supposed to turn south toward Kestmar. She stopped. She looked at the southern road, then at the northern one, then at Dan. She asked how much he was paying. Dan asked what for. For making sure he wasn't killed on the northern route. She's a former cartographer. She knows the roads. She knows languages. She knows how to handle knives when she has them. Dan thought. He needed a guide. He needed someone who knew this world. He needed someone who could fight because he himself could bring down a slope but couldn't parry a sword strike. He took a silver coin out of his bag, a Haldorian one. He held it out to her. A month's pay. Amber took the coin. She looked at it. Her eyes widened. Haldorian silver, she said quietly. Then she looked at Dan with different eyes. Not angry, not grateful, calculating. She was counting it in her head, figuring out how much it was worth. Dan saw that look. The contractors in Colorado had the same look when he showed them samples from the new site. Amber hid the coin, turned her horse north, said that for that money, she'd take him to the Gray Mountains and back, if he didn't do anything too stupid along the way. They rode together. By evening, they set up camp by a stream. Dan built a fire. Amber caught 2 fish with her bare hands. Dan watched her with admiration. She gutted the fish with his knife and grilled them on the rocks. They ate in silence. Then Amber asked why he was heading north. Dan thought for a moment. He could have lied. He could have told a half-truth. He could have said nothing. He took out the disc, showed it to her, explained. Not everything. Enough. The disc reveals valuable things. It can find what's hidden in the ground. He's a geologist. That's his job. Amber looked at the disc for a long time, then at Dan. Then she said he was either crazy or the richest man she'd ever met. And in either case, she was in the same boat as him. That night, Dan lay by the fire and thought. He had a horse, clothes, money, a knife, and now a companion who knew this world and could catch fish with her bare hands. It was more than he had a week ago. The disc warmed his pocket. Golden dots twinkled in the north. The gray mountains waited. For 3 days they rode north. The road narrowed. Villages grew fewer. The forest grew denser. The mountains on the horizon grew taller. The gray mountains lived up to their name. The peaks were gray steel in the morning light. The snow on the peaks glistened like broken glass. Dan looked at them and felt at home. Not because they reminded him of Colorado. They didn't. Different shapes, different angles, different rock. But mountains are mountains. They speak the same language everywhere. Folds, faults, watercourses, scree. Dan read the mountains like a book, and the mountains read him. Amber turned out to be a good companion. Quiet when necessary, talkative when useful. She knew the roads. She knew where it was safe to stop. She knew which villages welcomed strangers and which didn't. She knew the prices for everything from bread to horses. She counted every coin. Not hers, his. It was annoying and useful at the same time. On the second day of the journey, she asked how much money he had. Dan answered evasively. Amber said that if he was heading north, he needed more than silver. He needed supplies for 2 weeks. Warm clothes, ropes, tools, torches, oil for the torches, dried meat, salt. You can't do without salt in the mountains. Dan listened and nodded. She was right. He was used to expeditions. In Colorado, he wouldn't go into a mine without gear. Here, he'd already gone in twice with just his bare hands and a knife. That was stupid. In the next village, they stopped for a whole day. The village was called Karovit. It was bigger than Tilla. It had a blacksmith shop and a market. Dan bought everything Amber had listed, plus a rock climbing kit, ropes, pitons, a hammer. The local pitons were rough, but functional. Dan inspected each one and picked out the best ones. Amber watched him. She asked why he needed pitons. Dan explained. He climbs into caves. Pitons are needed for safety, for descending, for ascending. Amber said he was definitely crazy. Normal people don't climb into caves voluntarily. Dan chuckled. It's his job, he said. It was. It is. It will be. At the market in Karovit, he overheard a conversation. 2 men were talking about a village in the northeast, a 3-hour walk. People had been sick there for 2 weeks. The healer couldn't help. They needed a herb. Moonroot. Rare. It grows only in the mountains, only on certain types of rock. Dan pricked up his ears. Moonroot. A plant bound to the rock. That meant the disc could find it. He asked Amber about moonroot. She knew. A small plant with white flowers. It grows in rock crevices. The root is used in medicine. It costs a fortune. A single measure of moonroot was worth as much as a horse. Dan took out the disc. He asked it to show him the herbs. The disc reacted. The golden dots changed color. They turned greenish. Most of them went out. A few remained. One was close by. In the mountains to the north. A 2-hour walk. Dan pointed it out to Amber. She looked at the disc, at the dot, at the mountains, then at Dan. She said that if he found the moonroot, she would reconsider her assessment of his madness. They left the horses in the village and headed into the mountains. The climb was steep. The trail was barely visible. Dan walked ahead and studied the rock. Dolomite gave way to shale to granite. There was an old fault line here. 2 slabs had collided and buckled millions of years ago. In the fault zone, the rock was fissured. Moisture pooled in the cracks. Minerals were brought to the surface. An ideal place for rare plants that feed on what isn't found in ordinary soil. The disc guided him up the slope. The spot was getting closer. An hour and a half later, Dan stopped at a rock face, vertical, 5 meters high. In a crevice 3 meters up, he saw white flowers, small, fragile, like stars on gray stone. Moonroot. Amber exhaled. Then she said that it was there, and they were here, and between them lay 5 meters of smooth rock. Dan took off his backpack. He pulled out his pitons and hammer. He looked at the wall. He found cracks. 3 footholds. That would be enough. He hammered in the first piton. The second. He secured the rope. He started climbing. For a man who had been climbing rocks for 8 years, it wasn't difficult. 5 minutes later, he was at the crevice. The moonroot grew from a crack between 2 blocks of granite. Dan carefully dug around the root with his knife. He pulled it out whole. Long, white, with tiny offshoots. He put it in a small bag. He looked around. There were a few more bushes growing nearby. He took 3 roots. He left the rest. A geologist's rule: never take everything. Leave some for the future. He climbed down. Amber was standing below with her arms crossed. Her face showed a mix of irritation and admiration. She said he climbed like a mountain goat. Dan replied that mountain goats don't use safety ropes. They arrived at the village in the northeast by evening. The village was called Maravin. Small. Quiet. Too quiet. There turned out to be 7 patients, all children, all from the same family. Fever. Cough. Rash. The healer sat by the oldest child's bed and shook his head. He was old and tired. A young woman sat next to him on a stool, petite, with a round face, in a canvas apron, a pouch of herbs at her waist. She was sorting through dried leaves and grinding them in a mortar. Her movements were precise and quick. Dan approached. He asked if she needed moonroot. The girl looked up. She looked at him, then at the pouch in his hand. Then she stood up so abruptly that the stool fell. She took the pouch, opened it, and looked at the root. Her hands were trembling. She asked where he had found it. Dan said, in the mountains. She said moonroot didn't grow in these mountains. She had been searching for 6 months. She had traveled through every ravine. Nothing. Dan shrugged. He knew where to look. The girl's name was Hyun Cho. She was 19 years old. She was an herbalist, not a doctor. The doctor was her mentor. She grew up in a mountain village in the east. She came here 2 years ago. She treated people with herbs. She treated them well. But moonroot was beyond her capabilities. Too rare, too far away. She didn't know where to look. Hyun worked all night. She ground the root. She made a decoction. She gave it to the children to drink. Dan and Amber sat in the corner and waited. By dawn, the older child's fever had subsided. By noon, all 7 were drinking the broth and asking for food. The mother was sobbing by the door. The healer shook Hyun's hand and went to sleep for the first time in 3 days. Hyun sat on the floor by the wall with an empty mortar in her hands, staring into space. Dan walked over to her, sat down beside her, silently. After a minute, she began to speak, quietly, almost in a whisper. She said she had a younger brother. He died 3 years ago from the same illness. She was missing 1 root, just 1. She searched. She ran through the mountains day and night. She didn't find it. She returned empty-handed. Her brother died right before her eyes. Ever since then, she has been searching for the moon root everywhere. She collects every one she finds. She keeps them, dries them, so it never happens again. Dan listened. Then he took the remaining 2 roots out of his bag and placed them on her lap. Hyun looked at the roots, then at him. Her eyes were wet. She asked how much he wanted for them. Dan said nothing. Hyun clenched the roots in her fists and closed her eyes. Then she opened them. There was something new in them. Not gratitude. A decision. She said she was coming with him. Dan didn't answer. Hyun said she didn't care what he said. If he could find things like that, he needed a doctor. Because a man who climbs rocks for roots will break his neck sooner or later. Amber stood in the doorway and listened. She smirked. Then she told Dan that the girl was right. He was an idiot, and he needed a healer. Dan looked at Amber, at Hyun. The 2 women looked at him the same way, as if he were a problem that needed solving. He said, okay. Hyun packed her things in 10 minutes. A bag with 20 kinds of herbs, a mortar, a knife for roots, a change of clothes. That was it. The healer came out to see her off. He shook her hand, told her she was ready, that he had nothing more to teach her, that she should go and heal. Hyun bowed low to him. Then she turned and walked toward the horses. Amber let her ride behind her. The 3 of them rode out of Moravin. Dan rode ahead on his chestnut. Amber and Hyun rode on Amber's horse. Hyun was light. The horse didn't notice the extra weight. By evening, they had set up camp at the foot of the Gray Mountains. Dan lit a fire. Hyun prepared a herbal decoction for fatigue. Amber caught a rabbit in the snare she had set an hour ago. Dan watched the 2 women by the fire and thought. A week ago, he had been alone in the ravine with a bronze disc. Now he had a team of 3. One knew the roads and could kill with a knife. Another knew herbs and could heal. He knew the land and could find anything. It was a pretty good combination. Hayun asked where they were going. Dan pointed to the gray mountains. Hayun nodded. Then she said that 5 kinds of rare roots grew in the mountains that weren't found in the lowlands. If he helped her find them, she'd owe him everything. Dan said that nobody owed anybody anything. Hayun looked at him like he was an idiot. Amber laughed. For the first time in 3 days, the sound was unexpected, warm. They lay down to sleep around the fire. Dan lay there and listened to the night breathing. The mountains breathed differently than the plains. Heavier, deeper. He knew that breath. It was familiar. The gray mountains greeted them with rain. Light, cold, persistent. It started at dawn and didn't stop. The disk fell silent. The golden dots went out. The bronze was cold and lifeless. Dan put it in his pocket and didn't take it out. Rain was its weakness, not his, the disk's. Without the disk, he was just a man with a knife and a rope in foreign mountains. But even just a man with a knife and a rope is capable of something. They walked along a mountain trail through the gorge. The trail was narrow. The horses walked in single file. The river roared below, murky, swollen from the rain. Dan looked at the slopes and assessed them. The rock, the angle of the slope, water saturation. He was looking for signs of a landslide. There were none. The rock was solid, granite, reliable. After 3 hours, the trail led them to a mountain pass. Here, the wind blew in their faces, and the rain fell almost horizontally. Amber cursed under her breath. Hayun was silent, wrapping the herbs in oiled cloth. Beyond the pass, the trail descended into the valley, sheltered from the wind. The forest here was dense and dark. Fir trees, tall, old. Their branches closed over the trail like a roof. The rain barely reached them here. They dismounted and led the horses by the reins. The trail narrowed. The trees grew ever denser. Then the trail ended. A fence stood before them. Wooden, not very tall. Behind the fence were houses, 5 or 6. Smoke rose from the chimney of the nearest one. A mountain village, unmarked on the map. Dan approached the fence. A man came out of the house, an old man, hunchbacked, with a long stick in his hand. He looked at them from under his drooping eyebrows and asked what they wanted. Dan said they were travelers, looking for shelter from the rain. The old man looked at them for a long time. Then he opened the gate. It was warm inside. The stove was humming. Bundles of herbs hung on the walls. Hayun looked at them with a professional eye, then at the old man. She asked who had dried the herbs. The old man said it was his granddaughter. She was sick. She had been lying there for a month, unable to get up. Hayun asked to see her. The old man led her into the back room. There, on the bed, lay a girl, about 10 years old, pale, thin, breathing heavily. Hayun examined her. She touched her forehead, looked into her eyes, her throat, listened to her breathing. Then she went out to Dan. She said the girl needed gentian, yellow gentian, from the highlands. It only grows above the tree line. It's dangerous to go there in the rain, slippery, cold, zero visibility. Dan asked if the disc would help. Hayun reminded him that the disc doesn't work in the rain. Dan nodded. The disc didn't work, but Dan worked. He asked Hayun what gentian looked like. She described it. A low-growing plant, yellow flowers, a thick root. It grows on rocky slopes. It loves light. It loves wind. Can't stand shade, Dan thought. Rocky slopes in the highlands, light and wind. That means south-facing slopes, open, no forest, well-drained soil. He knew places like that. They're always on ridge lines or steep southern slopes. Geology suggested the botany. He put on his raincoat and went out into the rain. Amber followed him. He told her to stay. She said he wouldn't be walking in the mountains alone in the rain. They didn't argue. They went together. The climb took 2 hours. The rain was getting heavier. There was no trail. Dan walked along the ridge. He read the terrain. He was looking for the southern slopes. 1,000 meters above the valley, the forest ended. Bare rocks. The wind howled. Dan squinted through the rain and searched. Not for golden dots, for yellow flowers. Half an hour later, he found them. A small cluster of plants in a crevice between the rocks. The southern slope, exposed, exactly as Hayun had described. He cut 3 roots, put them in a small bag. Then he looked down. The valley lay at his feet like a bowl. Through the rain, he could see the village houses, smoke from the chimneys, the dark ribbon of the river, and something else. Figures were moving along the trail they had come up, 6 of them, on horseback, wearing identical cloaks. They were riding toward the village. Dan froze. Amber saw them too. She grabbed his arm and pulled him down behind a rock. They lay there and watched. The 6 riders rode up to the village. They stopped at the fence. One dismounted. There was a symbol on his cloak. Dan couldn't see it from a distance, but Amber could. She said one word: Seekers. Dan felt a chill run down his spine. Not from the rain. Seekers. The Order of the Velgard Crown. Here, in a nameless mountain village. Amber whispered that they were checking the villages, every single one, looking for relics, looking for those who seek relics. Dan thought of Hayun. She was down below, with the horses, with his bag, which contained the tablet with the disc and the scroll from the Haldor tomb. If the seekers searched the bag, if they found the scroll, if they saw the disc. He stood up. Amber grabbed his arm again, asked where. Dan said, downstairs. Amber said he was an idiot, that there were 6 armed men downstairs, that they had swords and crossbows and a royal warrant, that if they caught him with the Haldor relic, they'd hang him. Dan looked at her. Then he said that Hayun was down there alone. Amber fell silent. Then she let go of his hand. They went down quickly. Too quickly. Dan slipped twice. Once Amber caught him by the collar. When they approached the village from behind through the woods, the seekers were already inside. Dan heard voices, a commanding tone. An old man was answering something. Dan circled the village along the edge of the forest. He found the house where he'd left the horses. The horses were gone. Hayun was gone. His bag was gone. He froze. Then he saw her, behind the house, in the blackberry thicket. Hayun. She was crouching in the bushes, holding the reins of both horses. The horses' muzzles were wrapped in cloth so they wouldn't neigh. His bag was slung over her shoulder. Dan felt something warm spread through his chest. This 19-year-old girl had heard the riders and, in 3 minutes, had led the horses and their belongings away and hidden them in the bushes. He approached her quietly. She saw him and exhaled. Then she pointed toward the village and whispered that there were 6 of them and that they were asking about strangers. Dan nodded. They couldn't leave right now. There was only one trail. The searchers were on it. Going back along the wet ridge with the horses was impossible, Dan thought. Then he looked around. The forest, the river, the rocks, the land. He knew the land. The land was on his side. He asked Hayun if she could see where the river led. Hayun said the river flowed into a canyon to the west, narrow, deep. Dan walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down. The river ran through a gorge. The banks were rocky, but passable, for foot travelers, for horses. If they went through the water, through the shallow water near the bank, there would be no tracks. The rain would wash everything away. He said, "Let's go." They went down to the river. The water was cold, knee-deep. The horses walked reluctantly, but walked. Dan led the front one. Amber led the back one. Hayun walked between them, holding the bag of herbs above the water. They walked along the river for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. Dan had lost track of time. The canyon narrowed and widened. The walls rose 20 meters, 30. The rock was beautiful, layered shale with flecks of quartz. Dan looked at the walls and saw millions of years. Then the canyon turned. Around the bend, the river widened. The bank became gentle. The forest reached down to the water. They stepped onto the bank, wet, frozen. Dan looked around. No trail, no village, no searchers. They were gone. Amber sat down on a rock and wrung out her hair. Then she looked at Dan and said he was a madman after all, but a living madman. Hyun stood ankle-deep in the water, shivering. Dan took off his cloak and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him. Then she said that if he caught a cold, she wouldn't treat him, because it would be his own fault. Dan smiled. They set up camp in the woods by the river. They had a hard time getting the fire going. The wood was wet. Dan found some dead wood under the thick fir trees. He stripped off the bark, he whittled some kindling, the fire caught. Small, fickle, but warm. They sat around the fire and dried their clothes. Hyun brewed wormwood tea for the old man's granddaughter. Then she froze. She looked at the brew, then at the village they had left behind. Dan understood. The girl was in the village, the sick girl. Hyun held the medicine in her hands, and the girl was left behind, with the seekers. Hyun looked up. There was pain in her eyes. She said she couldn't go back. Dan said they would go back, when the seekers left. Hyun asked, what if they didn't leave? Dan was silent. He didn't know the answer. Amber was silent too. Then she said the seekers wouldn't stay long. They'd check things out and leave. A day, 2 at most. Hyun nodded, but her hands still clutched the bag of gentian. The night was cold. The rain finally stopped around midnight. Dan took out the disc. The bronze slowly heated up. Golden dots appeared, faint, blurry. The disc was waking up after the rain like a person after an illness. Slowly, hesitantly. But it was working. And it was showing something interesting. To the west, across the river, deep in the mountains, there was a dot. Bright. Brighter than any he had ever seen. Brighter than a jug of gold. Brighter than the medallion on the altar. Dan looked at it and felt his heart beat faster. Whatever it was big. Very big. He showed it to Amber. She looked. Then she looked west. Then she said there was nothing there, just mountains, passes, old mines, abandoned, dangerous. Dan smiled. Old mines, abandoned, dangerous. Those were his 3 favorite words. In the morning they headed west, but first Hyun left, alone, quietly, unnoticed. She returned 3 hours later, without the bag of gentian. Dan asked where she'd been. Hyun said she'd taken the medicine. Dan asked about the seekers. Hyun said they'd left at dawn. She'd left the decoction by the old man's door. She hadn't gone in. She didn't show herself. She just set it down and left. Dan looked at her. Hyun looked back at him. Without defiance, without embarrassment, with the simple calm of someone who had done what they had to do. Amber stood nearby and nodded silently. They drove west, toward a bright spot, toward the old mines, toward something big. The disc warmed his pocket, and golden dots flickered. Ahead were mountains, and Dan Marchetti drove toward them as if home. The abandoned mines began beyond the 3rd pass. Dan saw them from a distance, dark chasms in the mountainside, 5 entrances, maybe 6. The wooden supports had rotted and jutted out of the ground like the ribs of a dead beast. Rails, rusty, grown into the rock. Someone had once mined ore here. Dan dismounted and walked up to the nearest entrance. He crouched down. He touched the rock at the edge, brought it to his nose, sniffed. Iron ore. Magnetite by the look of it. The mine was an iron mine, not gold, not silver. Iron. Someone had mined ore here for forges. Long ago, a very long time ago. Then abandoned it. The reasons for abandoning a mine are always the same. The vein ran dry, or water flooded it, or it collapsed, or all of the above. Dan took out his flashlight. A bright spot glowed inside the mountain, deep down, below the level of the mine tunnels, much lower. He estimated the depth, 60 meters, maybe 70. That was a lot, without equipment, without an elevator, no safety team up top. Amber stood nearby, looking at the entrances. She said these were the Upper Crag mines. She'd heard of them. They'd been closed 200 years ago. A cave-in killed 30 miners. No one has gone down there since. The locals believe the spirit of the mountain lives down there. Dan nodded. Mountain spirits are usually mine gas, methane, or carbon dioxide. People went down. They choked. They died. The rest decided it was spirits. He took a coil of rope out of his bag and checked the knots. Hooks, a hammer, a knife, a flint, and 3 torches. That was all he had. Hayun approached and silently handed him a small pouch. Inside was a cloth soaked in peppermint oil. She told him to hold it to his face if he had trouble breathing. Not a cure-all, but better than nothing. Dan took the pouch and thanked her. Amber said she was coming with him. Dan said no. 1 entrance, 1 rope. If he didn't return in 6 hours, they should leave. Amber said that was the most idiotic thing she'd heard in the last month, and she'd heard a lot of idiotic things in the last month, because she was traveling with him. Dan looked at her. Then he said he needed someone up top to hold the rope. It's true, you can't go into a mine without someone on the surface to belay you. Amber fell silent. Then she nodded. Dan entered the mine. The first few meters were easy, a horizontal tunnel, wide. The ceiling reinforced with stone masonry. Old but sturdy. Built to last. The floor was littered with rock debris and rotten wood. The air was musty but breathable. Dan checked. He lit a splinter. The flame burned steady. That meant there was oxygen, no methane, yet. He walked deeper and counted his steps. 100, 200, 300. At the 100th step, the tunnel split in 2. Dan took out the compass. The needle pointed left. He went left. After 50 steps, the tunnel began to slope downward, a 15-degree incline, then 20, then 30. Dan braced his boots against the rock and held onto the walls. The rock was changing. Iron ore was giving way to something else. Dark, dense. Dan stopped and looked by the light of the torch. Basalt. Magmatic rock. This meant that the miners had broken through the sedimentary layer and entered the bedrock. Volcanic. Ancient. There could be anything beneath the basalt. Caverns, cavities, natural chambers formed by solidified lava. The slope leveled out. The tunnel turned into a natural cave. The walls were smooth, smelted, not the work of human hands. Lava had flowed through here millennia ago and left a tube behind. Dan walked through the lava tube and felt right at home. He had walked through ones like this in New Mexico. Different rock, different world, same principle. The tube went down and down. Then it leveled out. Then it opened up. Dan stepped out into the space and stopped. The torch illuminated about 5 meters around him. Beyond that, darkness. But the echo told him the space was enormous. He threw a pebble into the darkness. He counted. 1, 2, 3. Thud. 20 meters, at least. He lit a second torch and threw it forward. The torch flew in an arc and fell onto the stone floor. In its light, Dan saw walls, columns, arches. It wasn't a cave. It was a hall, built by people, carved out of basalt inside the mountain. The scale was different. The hall in the cave near Tilla was a room. This was like a cathedral. The ceiling rose 10 meters high. 12 columns as thick as a tree supported the vault. Stone shelves stood between the columns. Things lay on the shelves. Dan stepped closer. Scrolls, dozens of scrolls, leather ones, in stone cases. Clay tablets with inscriptions stood on the shelves. Next to them were bronze cylinders. A stone slab with a carved map hung on the wall. Dan raised the torch and looked at the map. The outlines of the continent, Arantia. 6 regions marked with symbols. 7 dots glowed red. Or was it paint? After 800 years, it's hard to tell. 7 dots. The Emperor's 7 seals. Dan stood before the map, his hands trembling. It was a library. The Haldorian library, hidden inside a mountain beneath an abandoned iron mine. Whoever built this mine 200 years ago didn't even know that beneath their feet lay an entire archive of a dead empire. Dan slowly walked along the shelves. He didn't touch anything. He just looked. Scrolls, tablets, maps, instruments of unknown purpose, engraved bronze plates. On one of the shelves lay an object that made him stop. A book. Not a scroll. A book, bound in leather, with bronze clasps. Dan picked it up carefully, heavy. He opened the first page. Text. The same language as on the coins and on the walls. He couldn't read it, but there were drawings on the pages. Diagrams. Blueprints. Dan flipped through the pages and recognized them. Maps of rock formations. Cross-sections of strata. Schematics of underground waterways. Whoever wrote this book was a geologist, or something very similar. The Haldor Empire knew geology, knew the rocks, knew the water tables, knew how to build underground. It wasn't sorcery, it was science. Ancient, forgotten, but science. Dan put the book in his bag. Then he walked to the far wall of the hall. There stood an altar, similar to the one in Tilla's cave, but larger. A stone case lay on the altar, sealed with wax. Dan carefully broke the seal. Inside lay a bronze cylinder. Inside the cylinder was a scroll. Thin leather, almost transparent. On the scroll was a map. Detailed. Very detailed. Dan unfolded it by the light of the torch and held his breath. It was a map of the Gray Mountains. Every pass, every peak, every valley. And there were markings on the map, dozens of markings, squares, circles, triangles. Next to each one, small text. Dan couldn't read the text, but he could read the map. The squares were at the entrances to the gorges, circles at the tops of the passes, triangles inside the mountain ranges. It was a map of the Haldorian caches, all the caches in the Gray Mountains. One of the 7 red dots on the wall map was right here in the Gray Mountains. A seal. One of the Emperor's 7 seals was hidden somewhere in these mountains, and Dan now had a map. He rolled up the scroll and put it in his top hat, the top hat into his bag. The 3rd torch was burning out. Dan couldn't stay any longer. He took one last look at the library. The shelves stretched into the darkness. He could see only a small part of them. There were thousands of scrolls here, thousands of tablets, the knowledge of an entire empire. He would return, definitely, with a team, with torches, in time, but not now. Climbing up the lava pipe took 3 times as long as the descent. Dan crawled up the 30-degree slope, bracing his elbows against the rock. The bag pulled him down. The torch went out. For the last 100 meters, he walked in the dark by feel. He touched the walls. He counted his steps. When a light appeared ahead, he felt his knees tremble. Not from exhaustion, from relief. Amber was standing at the entrance. She saw him and didn't say a word. She simply held out a flask of water. Dan drank it dry. Then he sat down on a rock and caught his breath. Hayun came over and examined his hands. Skin scraped off his elbows, abrasions on his palms. She silently took out some ointment and began to treat the wounds. Dan opened his bag and took out a book. He showed it to Amber. She took it, opened it, looked at the drawings, then at the text. Then she closed it and looked at Dan. She asked quietly what was down there. Dan said one word, library. Amber turned pale. Hayun stopped applying ointment to his elbows and looked up. Dan took out a cylinder with a scroll. He unrolled the map. He showed it to them. Dots, markings, and one red dot that he had transferred from the wall map. The seal, he said. Somewhere in these mountains, the Emperor's seal is hidden. Amber was silent. Hayun was silent. The wind whistled through the old mine tunnels. Dan rolled up the map. They went down to the camp by the river. No one spoke. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts. By the fire, Dan spread out the map and began comparing it to the one he'd drawn himself on the hide. The scales didn't match. The landmarks were different. But mountains don't change in 800 years. The peaks were in place. The passes were in place. The valleys were in place. He superimposed one map over the other and looked for matches. He found 3. The red dot of the seal stood in the western part of the Gray Mountains, in a place that was marked on his map as the Black River Gorge. A 3-day journey, maybe 4. Amber said she'd heard of the Black River Gorge. No one goes there. The river is black because it contains dissolved manganese. The water is poisonous. Nothing grows along the banks. Dan nodded. Manganese waters. Poisonous. That explained why no one had found the seal in 800 years. Who would go into a gorge with a black, poisonous river? He smirked. A geologist would. A geologist knows that manganese water is dangerous if swallowed, but doesn't kill on skin contact. A geologist knows that manganese in water indicates certain types of rock. Manganite, pyrolusite. They form under specific conditions. And under those same conditions, cavities form. Caves. Hiding places. The seal lay in the safest place in the world, in a place where no one wanted to go. In the morning, they set off westward. The journey to the Black River Gorge took 4 days, not 3 as Dan had calculated. The mountains do not like those in a hurry. The trails meandered. They had to go around the mountain passes. Once they had to wait half a day for the fog to lift. The horses walked cautiously. The rocks beneath their hooves were wet and slippery. Hayun gathered herbs at every rest stop. Her bag swelled up and began to look like a pillow. Amber was silent most of the time. She was thinking. Dan could see it on her face. She was calculating, estimating, weighing things up. On the second day of the journey, she asked what he planned to do with the seal. Dan replied that first they had to find it. Amber said that wasn't an answer. Dan agreed. It wasn't an answer. He didn't know what to do with the seal. He knew that, according to legend, the seals granted the right to the throne. He didn't need a throne. He didn't need power. He needed to understand what was happening, why he was here, why the disc had chosen him, what the bronze object that warmed his pocket and showed golden dots wanted from him. Amber listened and snorted. She said that philosophy was fine, but no one paid for philosophy, whereas the seal was worth enough to buy a kingdom. Dan looked at her. He said he wasn't selling it. Amber said he was an idiot. Then she fell silent for 3 hours. On the 3rd day of their journey, they met some people, a small caravan, 4 mules, 2 people, merchants. They were coming from the free cities of the coast and carrying salt. Dan bought 2 sacks from them. Salt was expensive in the mountains. The merchants shared the news. The Velgard crown had strengthened the Order of Seekers. Now there were 500 of them. Captain Cassian Vale had been granted special powers, the right to search without a warrant, the right to arrest without trial, the right to confiscate without compensation. Patrols were on the roads. 3 villages on the eastern road had been burned for harboring relics. Dan listened in silence. 3 villages burned. People, homes, livestock, everything. Because someone found a bronze coin in a garden and didn't turn it in. Amber turned pale. Hayun pressed her lips together and turned away. The merchants had left. The group stood on the trail in silence. Then Dan said they needed to hurry. 9 months by decree, but in reality, there was less time. If Cassian was looking for whoever found the relics before the order, if rumors about the wanderer with the gold had already spread, if someone in Till or Kestmar had let it slip, they might only have weeks left. On the 4th day, they descended into the gorge. Dan saw the river and stopped. Black. Not as a metaphor. The water was a thick, dark brown, almost black. It flowed slowly, heavily. The banks were bare. No grass, no moss, no lichen. The rocks on both banks were covered with a black coating. Manganese oxides. Dan knew that color. He'd seen it in Colorado, in old manganese mines. Dangerous, but not fatal, if you don't drink it, if you don't breathe in the fumes for too long, if you don't swim in it. Amber stopped 20 paces from the bank, said she wouldn't go any further. Hayun walked up to the water and sniffed. Then she backed away, said the water was bad, poisoned. Dan explained, manganese, dissolved in the rock, washed out by water, concentrated in the river, dangerous if ingested, relatively harmless upon skin contact if brief. The rocks on the shore are covered in manganese oxide. It's not poison on the surface, it's a mineral deposit. You can walk in it, you can't drink it. You can't breathe near the water for long in an enclosed space. It's safe in the open air. Amber listened with an expression that said she believed every word, and yet didn't believe a single one. Hayun took out a cloth with peppermint oil and handed one to each of them. They tied them around their faces. They looked like bandits. Dan went first. Along the shore, not through the water, over the rocks. The gorge was narrow. The walls rose 50 meters high. The light from above was dim. The rock on the walls was beautiful. Black layers of manganese deposits alternated with gray limestone and red iron ore. Like a cake. Dan read the walls and marveled. Millions of years compressed into strips of rock. Each layer is an era. Each crack is an event. An earthquake, an eruption, a flood. Everything is recorded in stone. He walked and looked. The disk glowed with an even golden light. The point was ahead. Close. After 2 hours of walking, the gorge widened. The river split into two branches. Between them stood a stone island. Not very high, about 10 meters across. A lone tree grew on the island. Dead. White. Like a skeleton. Dan looked at the disk. The dot glowed directly beneath the island. He crossed the left branch of the river over the rocks. The water reached his ankles. Black. Warm. He tried not to think about it. On the island, he looked around. Rocks. Gravel. A dead tree. Nothing resembling an entrance. Dan dropped to his knees and began shoveling through the gravel. Under the gravel was sand. Under the sand was a stone. Flat. Polished. A slab. Square. 1 meter by 1 meter, with a bronze ring in the center. Dan pulled on the ring. The slab didn't budge. He called out to Amber. She crossed the river with an expression of utter disgust on her face. Together they pulled. The slab shifted. Beneath it was a well. Stonework. Steps carved into the wall. Spiral. Descending into the darkness. Dan lit a torch and began to descend. Amber followed him. Hayun stayed above. She said someone had to watch the horses, and that she was afraid of enclosed spaces. The steps led downward. 20, 30, 40. At the 50th step, the well ended. Dan stood in a corridor. Narrow, low. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols, drawings, figures of people, scenes. Dan couldn't read the text, but the drawings spoke for themselves. A procession. People are carrying something round, toward the altar. A figure stands on the altar, tall, wearing a crown, arms raised. Emperor Haldor. The corridor led to a door, a stone door, sealed. A symbol was carved on the door. A compass rose, the same as on the disc. Dan held the disc up to the door. The bronze flashed gold. The door shook, slowly, heavily. It shifted to the right. Behind the door was a chamber, small, 3 meters by 3. A pedestal stood in the center. An object lay on the pedestal. Dan approached. He raised the torch. A sun-shaped disc. Bronze. But not ordinary bronze. The metal glowed from within with a warm amber light. Lines were engraved on the surface. A map. The contours of Arantia. And in the center of the map, a single point. Burning. Pulsating. The Emperor's first seal. Dan reached out and touched the seal. The world froze. The sound vanished. The light vanished. He stood in the void. And in the void, a voice sounded. Not a voice, a thought. A foreign thought in his head. A single word. Finally. Then the world returned. Sound, light, the torch in his hand, the camera around him, Amber behind him. She asked what had happened. Dan stood with the seal in his hand and said nothing. A voice in his head, a thought, someone else's, not his. Finally. Someone had been waiting. Someone inside the disc had been waiting for 800 years. Dan put the seal back in his bag. His hands didn't tremble. His head was clear. But something shifted inside him, like the slab they'd lifted upstairs. Something heavy shifted and opened the entrance to a place he hadn't suspected existed. They climbed the steps. They closed the slab. They covered it with gravel. They crossed the river. Hayun was waiting with the horses. She looked at Dan's face and asked nothing. They left the gorge before sunset. They set up camp 5 hours' walk from the Black River, by a stream with clear water. Dan sat by the fire, holding the seal in his palm. It was warm, like a disc, but different. The disc gave off an even heat. The seal pulsed, like a heartbeat. Amber sat across from him and watched. Then she asked what he had heard down there. Dan looked at her. Then he told the truth. A voice. One word. Finally. Amber was silent for a long time. Then she said she didn't like it. Dan agreed. Neither did he. The return journey from the Gray Mountains took 5 days. Dan led the group along a different route, not the one they had come by. He didn't want to go back through the mountain village where the Seekers were, didn't want to leave any traces. They walked along the ridges of the mountain ranges, along animal trails, along the beds of dried-up streams. Dan read the terrain and chose the path. Hayun gathered herbs. Her bag had turned into a bundle. She found 4 of the 5 rare roots she'd mentioned. The 5th grew even higher up. She said she'd go back for it, definitely. Amber watched the rear. She was used to danger and saw it before anyone else. Twice she stopped the group. The first time because she heard voices beyond the pass. They went around. The second time because she saw fresh hoofprints on the trail. Lots of hoofprints. A troop. They went around again. On the 3rd day of the journey, Dan noticed that the disc had changed. Ever since he found the seal, the disc had started showing more. The dots were brighter, further away, more detailed. Before, the disc showed direction and approximate depth. Now it showed contours, the outlines of what lay beneath the ground. Not clearly, blurred, like an echo, but enough to tell a coin from a sword, a chamber from a corridor. The seal had amplified the compass, or the compass had awakened from the seal's proximity. Dan didn't know, but he accepted it as fact. On the 4th day, they descended from the mountains and came out onto the road. Dan stopped. The road was not empty. A stream of people was moving along it. Wagons, pedestrians, horsemen, all in one direction, south. Dan asked a passing peasant what had happened. The peasant answered with a single word. Seekers. The Velgard Order has begun a roundup. They are combing everything north of Kestmar, village house by house, searching for relics, searching for those who hide them. People are fleeing south, to the free cities, where Velgard's decree does not apply. Dan stood on the side of the road and watched the stream of refugees, old people, women, children, mules laden with bundles, carts with meager belongings. People were abandoning their homes and leaving because someone had decided that all relics belonged to the crown. Hayun stood beside him. Her face was stony. She asked quietly if there was anything they could do. Dan was silent. Then he said they could. But not here. Not now. Right now, they needed a place. A base. A refuge. A place where they could bring people and where they would be safe. Amber looked at him intently. She asked what he was thinking. Dan took a Haldorian map out of his top hat. He unfolded it. He showed them a spot in the western part of the Gray Mountains, far from the roads, far from the villages. On the map next to the spot was a square. The square meant a structure, a Haldorian structure, a fortress, an outpost, something built of stone by people who knew how to build. If it's still standing, that's their refuge. Amber looked at the map, then at the mountains, then at Dan. She said he wanted to find a Haldorian fortress in the mountains and live in it. Dan said yes. Amber said it was madness. Dan said the whole world was madness. Amber couldn't think of a counter-argument. They turned west, away from the highway, away from the stream of refugees, into the mountains. The journey took 2 days. Dan navigated using both the map and the disc. The map showed the direction. The disc showed the details. Golden dots twinkled ahead. Many dots. The mountains were full of hidden things. At the end of the second day, they climbed a pass, and Dan saw it. The fortress stood on a rocky ledge, carved into the stone. Part of the walls had collapsed. The tower was leaning. There was no gate, but the foundation was intact. Thick walls of hewn granite, 2 levels, an inner courtyard, a water source. A stream flowed down the rock face straight into the courtyard. Dan dismounted and entered through the gate opening. It was quiet inside. A stone floor, stone walls, a stone ceiling on the first level. The second level was open to the sky. The roof had long since collapsed, but the rooms on the first level were intact. Dry, sturdy. 800 years and the walls still stand. The Haldorians built to last. Dan inspected every room. 6 on the first level, 1 large, 5 small. The large one was a hall. A hearth by the wall, stone benches, even a table. Stone, carved from a single block. The small rooms had stone platforms, beds, niches in the walls for belongings. Everything was simple. Everything was functional. Everything was in place. Hayun walked in and looked around. Then she said it was livable. It needed repairs. It needed a roof on the second level. It needed doors. It needed furniture. But it was livable. Amber stood in the center of the courtyard and silently assessed it. Then she said the location was good. 1 entrance, cliffs on 3 sides, a view of the valley below. An enemy couldn't approach unnoticed. Water inside, you can hold out against a siege. Dan smiled. He was looking for a house. Amber saw a fortress. Hayun saw a hospital. Everyone saw what they wanted to see. They began to settle in. The first day was spent cleaning up. Stones, rubble, debris from the old roof. They carried it all out into the yard. On the second day, Dan repaired the walls. He filled the cracks with clay. He reinforced the gate opening. He carved a simple door out of wood. Not pretty, but sturdy. On the third day, Hayun set up the kitchen in the large hall. The hearth was working. The chimney was intact. She cooked a hot meal for the first time in a week. Rabbit soup with herbs. Dan ate and thought it was the best meal he'd ever tasted in both worlds. Amber handled defense. She set snares along the approaches. She found 2 vantage points from which the trail was visible, half a day's walk down. She made a hiding place for weapons. They had no weapons besides knives, but a habit is a habit. On the 4th day, Dan took out a book from the Haldorian library and tried to read it. The text was foreign, but the illustrations were clear. Diagrams of rock formations, cross-sections of layers, water tables. He compared the Haldorian diagrams with what he knew. He found parallels. Haldorian geologists used different terminology, but saw the same things he did. Layers, faults, veins, karst. Science is the same in any world. He showed the book to Hayun. She looked at the section on plants, drawings of herbs, with captions she couldn't read. But the drawings were accurate. She recognized 6 out of 10. The other 4 didn't grow in these mountains, or had gone extinct, or had changed over 800 years. They needed someone who could read the Haldorian text. Dan knew that. Amber knew that. Hayun knew that. Without a translation, the book and the scrolls were half useless. Dan could read the maps and diagrams, but not the text. Amber said there were scholars in the free cities of the coast, historians, linguists, Those who study the Haldorian legacy. Some can read the ancient language, but they charge a high price. And not all of them are honest. Some work for the order. Some sell information to the highest bidder. Dan nodded. He didn't just need a translator. He needed someone he could trust. People like that aren't for sale on the market. He put the book back in his bag. That evening, they sat by the hearth in the great hall. The fire crackled. Shadows danced on the walls. Dan took out the seal and placed it on the stone table. The bronze disc glowed with a soft amber light. It pulsed like a heart. Amber stared at the seal without looking away. Then she said that any kingdom would pay so much gold for this thing that it couldn't be carried away in 10 carts. Dan nodded. Then he put the seal back in his bag. He wasn't selling it. Heyoon brewed some herbal tea. They drank in silence. Outside the fortress walls, the wind howled. The mountains breathed. Dan stared into the fire and thought about the voice that had finally spoken, about the man or creature or god who had waited 800 years and waited for him. After a week of living in the fortress, Dan went down into the valley for supplies, alone. Amber protested. Dan said that 2 people on a mountain trail were more conspicuous than one. Amber said that 1 person on a mountain trail was more likely to die than 2. Dan went alone anyway. The nearest town was called Talvin, a small trading town at the crossroads of 2 roads. Not Velgard territory. Free. Neutral. Relatively safe. Dan reached Talvin by noon. The town was bustling. Refugees from the north filled the streets. Merchants had jacked up prices. The market was... There was nowhere to sit in the taverns. Dan bought supplies: grain, salt, oil, dried meat, cloth, nails, rope. He loaded everything onto his horse. Then he went into a tavern, sat in a corner, ordered beer and stewed meat. He listened. The conversations were all the same. Seekers, roundups, confiscation, executions. 7 people had been hanged on the eastern road for possessing Haldorian silver. Among them was a woman with 2 children. The children were sent to the royal orphanage. That was a polite name for a workhouse. Dan gripped his mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then he relaxed his hand. Anger doesn't help. Anger clouds the mind. He finished his beer and got ready to leave. At the door, he bumped into a woman, tall, blonde, in a hooded travel cloak. She was walking fast, almost running. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red. She collided with Dan and dropped the book she'd been clutching to her chest. The book fell to the floor and opened. Dan bent down to pick it up. He saw the text, Haldorian. He recognized the letters, the same ones as in the book from the library, the same ones on the walls of the tombs. The woman snatched the book and clutched it to her chest. She looked at Dan in horror. Then she turned and ran. Dan stood there for a second. Then he went after her. He didn't run. He walked. Quickly. She turned into an alley, then into another. Then she stopped at a blank wall, a dead end. She turned toward him. She had a knife in her hand, a small one, a lady's knife. She held it clumsily. The blade trembled. Dan stopped 5 steps away. He raised his hands. He said he meant her no harm. She told him to get lost, that she knew nothing, that the book was hers, personal, not Haldorian. Dan looked at the book, then at her. He said the book was Haldorian. He could see the letters. He wasn't a seeker. He didn't need her book. He needed someone who could read what was written in it. The woman froze. The knife stopped trembling. She looked at him intently. A long assessing. Then she asked who he was. Dan told the truth, a traveler from the north, looking for a translator of Haldorian texts. Pays well. The woman was silent. Then she put the knife away. She said her name was Leah Everett, that she was the former daughter of Baron Everett of the Kingdom of Velgard. Former because she had fled a dynastic marriage 2 years ago. Since then, she had been living in the free cities. translating texts, teaching languages. She sells her knowledge to those who pay. She reads Haldorian fluently, and writes it, and speaks it. The book in her hands is a Haldorian dictionary she's been compiling for 3 years, from fragments of inscriptions found in ruins. The only copy. Her life. If the seekers find the book, they'll hang her. Not for the relic, for the knowledge. The Velgard crown doesn't want anyone but their scholars to be able to read Haldorian. Dan listened and nodded. Then he asked if she wanted a job, a safe place, food, a roof over her head, texts that no one had read in 800 years. Leah looked at him for a long time. Then she asked what kind of texts. Dan took a scroll out of his bag, the first one from the cave near Tilla. He unrolled it. He showed it to her. Leah took the scroll. Her hands stopped trembling. She read. Her lips moved. Her eyes darted across the lines. A minute later, she looked up. She asked quietly where he had found it, fuck. Dan said it was in the mountains. Leah said it was a Haldorian navigation document, instructions for traveling through the Empire's underground roads, with coordinates, with descriptions of landmarks, with warnings about dangers. A document that was 800 years old, and it was in perfect condition. Dan put the scroll away. He asked again, work, safety, texts. Leah stood at the end of a dead-end alley in a strange city, a Haldorian dictionary in her hands and her eyes red from crying. She had run away, from Velgard, from marriage, from the Seekers. She had no home, no protection, no future. Only the book she held to her chest like a child. She said yes. Dan brought Leah to the fortress the next day. Amber met them at the gate. She looked at Leah, at her posture, at her clothes, at her hands without calluses. She said quietly to Dan that he picked up homeless people like dogs. Dan said that Amber had been homeless too when they met. Amber fell silent. Hayun came out with a mug of hot tea and handed it to Leah. Leah took it. Her hands were shaking again. She entered the fortress. She saw the walls, the hearth, the stone table, the stream in the courtyard. She stopped. She looked around. And for the first time in the 2 days Dan had known her, she smiled. Quietly. Just with her lips, but she smiled. That evening, Dan laid everything out in front of Leah. The book from the library, the scroll, the map from the cylinder, the medallion. Leah worked until dawn. She read, she translated, she took notes. Her dictionary lay open beside her. She checked it and added new words. By morning, her eyes were red and her gaze was intense. She said that the book from the library was a treatise on geomancy, the art of reading the earth. Haldorian geology, the science of how the earth stores things and how to find them. The author of the treatise described principles that Dan knew: rock strata, water tables, mineral signs. But he went further. He described how the earth remembers, how a place where an object was laid retains its imprint even after the object is removed, how plants react to what lies beneath their roots, how water changes taste over different rock types. It wasn't magic. It was science. Deep, precise, lost 800 years ago. Dan listened and felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was his language, his science, translated into other terms. A different system, but his. Leah translated the map. The markings on it were hiding places. Squares were fortresses and outposts. Circles were observation points. Triangles were vaults. Underground, sealed, full of things. And the 7 red dots on the wall map in the library were the 7 seals. Dan had already found one. 6 remained. Leah showed their approximate locations. 1 in the far south, 1 on the islands, 1 in the capital of Velgard, 1 in the flooded city, 2 in places she couldn't pinpoint without additional text. Dan sat and stared at the map. 6 seals, scattered across the entire continent, 1 right in the enemy's capital, one underwater. It was madness. Beautiful. Thrilling. Madness. Amber stood behind him and looked too. Then she said quietly that if he was going to do this, she needed a raise. Hayun made tea and handed it out to everyone. 4 mugs, 4 people around a stone table in the Haldor fortress. Dan looked at them. Amber with her knives and calculating gaze. Hayun with her herbs and quiet concern. Leah with her book and burning eyes. 3 women he'd picked up along the way, each with her own wound, each with her own reason for being here. He raised his mug, toasted to the job. All 4 drank in silence. Beyond the fortress walls, dawn was breaking. The moon in the fortress had changed everything. Dan didn't sit still. Every 3 days, he went into the mountains with a disc. He found caches, small storerooms, abandoned outposts. Every time he returned with something. Bronze tools, clay tablets, scrolls. Once, he brought back a set of silver surgical instruments. Hayun held them in her hands and wept. Once, he brought a sealed box of seeds. Hayun planted them in the fortress courtyard. A week later, sprouts emerged from the ground. Plants no one had seen in 800 years. Leah worked day and night, translating, compiling a catalog, book after book, scroll after scroll. Her vocabulary tripled. She read Haldorian no longer with a dictionary, but by ear. The language lived within her. She said it was beautiful, precise, mathematically rigorous, every word in its place, like a stone in a wall. Amber was building defenses. No, Amber was building infrastructure. She found a trail that led from the fortress to the highway through 3 mountain passes. She scouted it. She marked landmarks. She found 3 spots where an ambush could be set up. 2 caves for cover, 1 ford across the river. She drew a map of the surrounding area for a 5-day journey in every direction. Dan watched her work and thought she would make an excellent geologist scout. She saw the terrain as he saw the rock, in layers, connections, paths. In the 3rd week, people arrived at the fortress. Dan hadn't been expecting them. A family from a village on the eastern road. A man, a woman, 2 children. The prospectors had burned their house. They were heading west, without a destination, without hope, just walking. They found the trail to the fortress by chance. They saw smoke coming from the chimney and followed it. Dan stood at the gate and watched them. Dirty, hungry. The frightened children huddled close to their mother. The man stood in front, holding an axe. Not as a threat, for protection. That's how people hold an axe when they have nothing left. Dan opened the gate wider. Hayun brought out bread and hot soup. The children ate greedily. The woman cried. The man ate in silence and didn't look up. Then he said they would leave in the morning. They didn't want to be a burden. Dan said they could stay. The man looked up. He looked at Dan, then at the fortress, at the stone walls, at the stream in the courtyard, at the hearth with the fire. And for the first time in days, he relaxed his shoulders. He was a carpenter. His wife was a weaver. A week later, furniture appeared in the fortress. Wooden bed frames, shelves, chairs, coat hooks. The weaver mended clothes. She patched raincoats. She knitted with wool that Amber had traded for from the shepherds in the valley. Another week later, 3 more arrived. An old man and 2 young men, miners from a closed mine. The prospectors had confiscated the mine and driven out the workers. The miners had heard from the carpenter's family that there was a place in the mountains, a safe one, with a kind host. Dan smirked when he heard that. A kind host. A dead geologist from Colorado. The miners turned out to be useful. They knew rock. Not like Dan. Differently. Practically. How to break it. How to lay it. How to secure it. They repaired the wall in 2 days. They worked silently and efficiently. Dan worked alongside them and listened. They talked about mines, about rock types, about veins. He told them about strata and faults. They looked at him with respect. He spoke their language, the language of stone. By the end of the first month, 11 people were living in the fortress. 4 from Dan's team, the carpenter's family, 3 miners, and 2 more, a woman with a little girl. They arrived at night, quietly, with no belongings. The woman was bruised. The girl was silent. Hae-yoon treated their wounds. She didn't ask questions. Dan didn't ask questions.
Amber didn't ask questions. They stayed. The fortress was changing. From abandoned ruins, it was turning into a living place. Smoke from the chimney, voices in the courtyard, the sound of a hammer, the smell of food, a child's laughter. The first laughter in a month. Dan stood on the fortress wall and looked down into the courtyard. 11 people. His people. No, not his. Just people who had nowhere else to go. Amber climbed up to him, stood beside him. She was silent for a long time. Then she said he was spending money. Gold from the stashes was going toward food and supplies for all these people. Less than half remained in his bag. Dan nodded. He knew. Amber said that wasn't right, that he needed to save up, to build a stockpile, that there were 6 seals ahead and every expedition cost money, that he couldn't feed the whole world. Dan was silent. Then he said the mountains were full of caches. He'd find more. Amber said he was an idiot. Then she fell silent. Then she said quietly that he was a handsome idiot. Dan turned his head and looked at her. She was looking down into the valley. Her cheeks were red, not from the cold. She turned and walked down without looking back. Dan remained standing on the wall. A stream flowed in the mountains to the west. People came down the stream. The people found the fortress. The fortress became a home. He hadn't planned on that. He'd planned to find a refuge for a team of 4. But he ended up with a settlement of 11. And he knew there would be more. Rumors spread fast. There's a place in the mountains, a safe one, with a man who knows how to find things in the ground, who shares what he finds, who doesn't ask where you're from or why you came. He just opens the gate. In the second month, Dan went down to Talvin again. He needed tools, shovels, pickaxes, saws. The fortress was growing, and it needed hands, and the tools those hands used. At the market in Talvin, he heard a name, Cassian Vale. The captain of the Order of Seekers was 2 days' journey away. He was heading west, with a detachment of 30 men. He was looking for someone, a man, a wanderer, who finds relics before the Order, who leaves empty hiding places in his wake, who, according to rumors, lives in the mountains. Dan stood in the market with a shovel in his hands and felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Not literally, figuratively. Cassian knew. Not exactly, not everything, but enough. He was heading west, toward the Grey Mountains, toward the fortress, toward the 11 people sleeping under a stone roof, believing they were safe. Dan tossed the shovel into the cart, bought everything he needed, and headed back, quickly. By the time he returned to the fortress, it was dark. He gathered a team, 4 of them, Amber, Hae-yoon, Leah, and the oldest of the miners. He told them Cassian was coming. Amber wasn't surprised. She'd been expecting this. She said the fortress could be defended. 1 entrance, thick walls. 30 men wouldn't be able to storm it if the defenders were ready. Dan shook his head. He didn't want to fight. There were children in the fortress, a wounded woman, an old man. A fight meant blood. A fight meant death. He was a geologist, not a military commander. He needed a different plan. He took out a map, a Haldorian one. He spread it out on the table. He showed them a spot west of the fortress, a 5-hour journey, an old Haldorian road, an underground one. It ran through the mountain and emerged on the southern slope. If the entrance still existed, if the road hadn't collapsed, that was their escape route. Amber looked at it. She said that an underground road through the mountain wasn't an escape route. It was a trap. If the entrance were blocked behind them, they'd be trapped under the mountain with no way out. Dan said there was a way out. The map marked 2 exits, north and south. If the northern one were blocked, the southern one would be clear.
Leah confirmed it. The scroll with navigation instructions describes this road. It's 4,000 paces long, wide enough for a cart. The ceiling is high. Air is supplied through ventilation shafts. The Haldoans built underground roads for trade, not for escape. But it'll work for escape, too. The miner said he saw the entrance 2 days ago when he went hunting. A rock wall with a clean cut, overgrown with bushes, but the stonework is visible. Dan nodded. In the morning, they'll check it out. If the road is intact, it's their safety net. If not, he'll think of something else. At night, he lay in his room and stared at the ceiling. Cassian was coming for him. 30 armed men, a royal mandate, the right to kill, the right to burn. Dan clenched the disc in his fist. The bronze was warm, and for the first time ever, the disc did something it hadn't done before. A golden glow appeared on its surface. Not dots, not a map, a word. One word, engraved in light on the bronze. Dan read it. Not because he knew Haldorian, because the word was simple, and the translation came on its own, like a language that had awakened in his head in the early days. One word. Trust. Dan closed his eyes. Trust. What? Whom? The bronze disc that speaks one word at a time. The dead emperor who imprisoned himself in metal. Or the earth that had always been on his side. He fell asleep with the disc in his hand, and for the first time, he had a dream. Not his dream, someone else's. A city, huge, white stone, towers reaching into the sky, squares full of people, and above the city, the sky, bright, moonless, a moonless night. And the city is sinking, slowly, like the roadside that day with the bandits. Walls are cracking, towers are leaning, people are screaming. The earth opens its mouth and swallows everything. And in the center of the dying city stands a man with a bronze disc on his chest, tall, wearing a crown. His face is calm. He looks at Dan through 800 years,
Through a dream, and says one word. Trust. Dan woke up at dawn, drenched in sweat, with the disc glowing gold in his hand. He sat up, exhaled, then stood and went to the team. We need to check the underground passage. Cassian is close. Time is short. In the morning, Dan took Amber and the senior miner with him. His name was Gareth, broad-shouldered, silent, hands like shovels. He knew stone no worse than Dan, just differently. Dan saw the layers and the history. Gareth saw strength and weakness. Together, they were the perfect pair to check the underground passage. They found the entrance in 2 hours. Gareth was right. A rock wall with a clean cut. Bushes covered the lower part. Dan cleared the branches with his knife. Beneath them was masonry, Haldoan, hewn stone. The blocks fit so tightly that a blade couldn't be slipped between them. 800 years. Not a crack, not a shift. The entrance had been sealed from the inside, not by a collapse, intentionally. Someone had sealed off the passage. Dan pressed the disc against the masonry. The disc heated up. An outline appeared on the surface. A tunnel behind the wall. Intact. No collapses. Dan could see it as clearly as an X-ray. An arched vault. A level floor. 3 meters wide, 4 meters high. The Haldoans built on a grand scale. Gareth examined the masonry and said the top 2 rows could be dismantled. The mortar was old, crumbling. The lower rows shouldn't be touched. They were load-bearing. They worked for 3 hours. Dan and Gareth dismantled the stones. Amber stood guard. When the top rows were removed, a passageway opened up. Narrow, a meter high. Enough to crawl through. A chill wafted from the opening. Dry, clean. The air was moving. That meant the ventilation was working. The ventilation shafts weren't blocked. After 800 years. Dan squeezed inside first. He lit his torch and froze. A road. A real road. A paved floor. Walls faced with polished stone. An arched vault with a keystone every 10 meters. Channels ran along the walls. Drainage channels. Dry, but intact. Every 50 paces there was a hole in the ceiling, a ventilation shaft. Dan looked up and saw a tiny speck of light, the sky.
The shafts had been bored through the entire thickness of the mountain, dozens of meters of rock, and they were working. He walked forward. Amber and Gareth followed him. They walked for 20 minutes. The road was straight, smooth, no forks, no traps. A trade route, not a military facility. Wagons carrying goods once traveled this road, through the mountain, under the mountain. Dan counted his steps. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. At 4,000, the road hit a wall, a second entrance, sealed off just like the first. Dan pressed his ear against the stone. Silence. Then a faint sound. Water. A stream. The southern slope. The road led to the south side of the mountain, where there were streams and forests and no villages for 2 days' journey, the perfect escape route. They returned to the northern entrance. Dan gathered the team in the fortress. He spread out the map. He explained the plan. The road was intact. 4,000 paces, 2 exits. The northern one next to the fortress. The southern one on the other side of the mountain. If Cassian came, they would lead everyone across the road. People, horses, belongings, everything they could carry. They would block the northern entrance behind them. Cassian would find an empty fortress, an empty courtyard, a cold hearth. No one. Amber said it might work if they made it in time. 11 people, 2 children, an old man, belongings, horses. How long would it take to get everyone across the road? Dan said 2 hours, maybe 3. Amber said they needed to know when Cassian would arrive. They needed a lookout. She would post watchmen on the trail, 2 men, in shifts, day and night. Gareth and 2 young miners volunteered. Dan agreed. 2 days were spent preparing. Dan widened the northern entrance. Now a horse could pass through it. Gareth reinforced the arch above the entrance with logs. The miners hauled stones to block the passage from the inside in 10 minutes. Hayun put together a medical kit for the crossing. Bandages, ointments, decoctions, water in flasks. Leah packed scrolls and books in leather cases. The carpenter nailed together boxes for their belongings. The weaver sewed sacks. Even the children helped. They carried stones into the courtyard and stacked them against the wall. Small stones, but with serious faces. Dan watched this and thought. A month ago, he was alone in the ravine. Now 11 people were preparing to flee across the mountain because he had brought danger to them. No, the danger was there before him. The Seekers had been burning villages before he found the first treasure. People had been fleeing before he opened the fortress gates. He hadn't brought the danger. He had drawn attention to it. They were different things, but the result was the same. The people who had trusted him were in danger because they had trusted him. On the 3rd day, just before dawn, Gareth ran into the fortress. Dan woke up to a knock on the door. Gareth was standing in the doorway. He was breathing heavily. He had run from the lookout point. 3 hours running along a mountain trail. He said one word. They're coming. Dan got up, got dressed, went out into the courtyard. The sky was turning gray. Dawn was an hour away. He woke everyone up, quietly, without shouting, without panic. He approached each person, spoke calmly. Get ready. Take only what's necessary. We're going over the mountain. People were waking up. The children rubbed their eyes. The woman with the bruises pressed the girl close to her and stood up. She was already used to running away. Packing took 40 minutes. Bags, crates, flasks. The horses were loaded. Dan stood at the gate and counted. 11 people, 3 horses, 4 mules they'd bought last week. That's all. Hayun was the last to approach. She was carrying a pot with sprouting Haldorian seeds. Dan looked at the pot, then at her. Hayun said these were seeds that were 800 years old. She wouldn't leave them behind. Dan didn't argue. They moved toward the entrance to the underground passage, a 20-minute walk along the path through the forest. Dan led the way with a torch. Amber brought up the rear. The northern entrance was open. Dan went inside. He raised the torch. People followed him in, one by one. The children clung to their mothers. An old man walked, leaning on a miner's shoulder. The horses snorted but kept moving. The mules balked. Gareth pulled the lead one by the reins and cursed under his breath. When the last person entered, Dan gave the signal. Gareth and 2 miners began to block the entrance. The stones fell into place quickly, tightly.
10 minutes later, the entrance was gone. All that remained outside was a rock face with some brush. Nothing suspicious.
They set off. Torches lit the path 10 paces ahead. The ceiling receded into the darkness. The walls glistened with moisture. The children were silent. Even the horses walked quietly. Their hooves clattered dully against the stone. The sound carried forward and returned as an echo. 4,000 steps, Dan counted. 500. 1,000. 1,500. They stopped at 2,000. A rest. Dan handed out water. Hae-yoon checked on the old man. Blood pressure, pulse. He was pale, but holding on. The children sat on the stone floor and stared at the torches with wide eyes. A boy of about 7 asked his mother if they were under the mountain. His mother said yes. The boy said it was beautiful here. Dan looked at the walls, at the arches of the vault, at the drainage channels. The boy was right. It was beautiful here.
The Haldoans didn't just build to be sturdy. They built to be beautiful, even underground. They moved on. 3,000 steps. 3.5. Leah walked beside Dan and spoke softly. She read the inscriptions on the walls by torchlight. Names, distances, signposts, a trade route. There was a route here. Destinations, warehouses along the way. Leah pointed to a niche in the wall. Inside stood stone vessels, sealed. Dan took one out, heavy. He opened it. Grain, petrified by time. But once it had been a supply for travelers. A warehouse in the middle of the mountain. 4,000 steps. The wall. The southern entrance. Dan placed the disc against it. The bronze heated up. An outline beyond the wall. A forest. A stream. No one around. Gareth began to break apart the masonry. He worked quickly. Stones flew. Light poured into the tunnel. Morning light, bright after the darkness. People squinted. The children covered their eyes with their hands. Then, one by one, they stepped outside. The southern slope of the mountain. A forest. A stream. Birds. The air smelled of pine needles and wet earth. A woman with a little girl fell to her knees and pressed her palms against the grass. The old man sat down on a rock and closed his eyes. The miners looked up at the sky. Amber stood and listened. Silence. No horsemen, no voices, no one. They were gone. Dan had blocked the southern entrance, not as tightly as the northern one. He'd left a way back. Then he led the group down the slope toward the stream. They set up camp. Not a fortress, just a camp. Cloth tents, a fire in a pit so the smoke wouldn't be seen. Hae-yoon placed a pot of sprouts by the stream. They were alive, green, stubborn, just like Hae-yoon herself. In the evening, Dan climbed to the ridge, alone. He looked north, to the other side of the mountain where the fortress remained. Somewhere out there was Cassian Vale, 30 men, swords, crossbows, a royal mandate, and an empty fortress, a cold hearth. Stone walls, without people. Dan stood on the ridge and thought. They'd left, but they hadn't won. They'd left. Cassian wouldn't stop. He'd find the tracks. He was smart. He'll find the trail. He'll find the entrance. Maybe he'll find the way. It's only a matter of time. A month, 2, 6 months. Sooner or later, Cassian will come back, and then there will be nowhere to run. Dan went down to the camp. He sat by the fire. Amber came over. She sat down next to him, silently. Then she said he was thinking too loudly. Dan smiled. He asked if she could hear thoughts. Amber said no. She could see his face, and his face was thinking out loud. They sat side by side. The fire crackled. Hae-yoon slept by the tent, curled up like a cat. Leah sat a little way off with a book and a torch. She was reading. She was always reading. Dan said quietly that he had to go.
to look for the rest of the seals. 6 of them, all over the continent. If he could gather them all before Velgard, if he figured out why they were needed, maybe then he could stop it. Amber was silent. Then she said she was going with him. Dan said someone had to stay with the people. Amber said Gareth would stay. He's reliable. The miners too. The carpenter would build what was needed. The people need the fortress, not her. But Dan needs her, because he'll crawl into the next hole in the ground and break his neck without her. Dan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring into the fire. Her cheeks were red, not from the fire. He said okay. They left at dawn, the 4 of them. Dan, Amber, Haeyoon, Leah. Haeyoon refused to stay behind. She said that without her, Dan would die from some stupid thing like a poisonous berry or a snake bite. Leah said that without her, Dan wouldn't be able to read a single inscription in any tomb. They were both right. Dan left Gareth a bag of gold from the mountain caches. Enough for 6 months. Plus a map of the area with marked spots where more could be found. Gareth took it and nodded. No words were needed. He understood everything. The first destination was to the south. Leah determined the approximate location using a Haldorian map and a navigational space. The second seal lay in a flooded city. The city was called Altaran, once a port on the shore of an inland sea. 800 years ago, the sea rose and the city went under. Now there was a shallow lake there. Fishermen sometimes saw the roofs of buildings underwater on clear days. The journey south took 3 weeks. They traveled on roads and off-road. They bypassed cities. They avoided patrols. Amber knew the trails. She knew where it was safe and where it wasn't. Haeyoon gathered herbs at every stop. Her supplies grew. Leah read the scrolls in the evenings by the campfire and translated them aloud. Dan listened and memorized. The history of Haldor, the Emperor, his advisors, his enemies, the moonless night. The catastrophe, the city sank into the ground. The Emperor knew in advance. He couldn't stop it, but he could hide it. He hid the knowledge, he hid the relics, he hid the seals, and he hid himself in a bronze disc. Leah read this in one of the scrolls and fell silent for the entire evening. Then she looked at Dan and asked if he was talking to him, to the Emperor. Dan said that the conversation was loud, one word at a time, sometimes a thought, sometimes a dream. Leah nodded. Then she said that this was the most important thing in the world, literally, the Emperor's soul in a bronze disc. If they find out about this, if Cassian finds out, if the Crown finds out, armies will come for that disc. Dan knew. He carried the disc close to his heart and felt its warmth every second. The warmth of a man who died 800 years ago and was still waiting. On the way south, they passed through villages. Dan stopped at every one. He couldn't help it. In one village, an old woman with a granddaughter. Haeyoon treated her. Dan found the right herbs through the disc. The granddaughter was back on her feet in 2 days. In another village, a drunken knight, a former one. He drank because he'd lost his father's sword, the family heirloom, the only thing that connected him to his lineage. The sword had been stolen at a fair 10 years ago. Dan asked the disc. The disc showed a spot, in a ditch behind the inn. The thief had buried the sword because he couldn't sell it, too conspicuous. Dan dug it up, brought it to the knight. The knight held the sword and looked at the blade, and his hands didn't tremble for the first time in years. Amber stood nearby and shook her head silently. Then she told Dan quietly that he couldn't save everyone. Dan replied that not everyone, just those he'd met. Amber turned away. Dan saw her face in profile. Something was changing. Something was slowly melting behind her crossed arms and sharp words. She watched as he gave and felt no regret. And it was breaking something inside her, some kind of wall she had been building for years. At the end of the 3rd week, they saw a lake. Huge, gray, flat. A fishing village stood on the shore. A dozen boats, nets on poles, the smell of fish and seaweed. Dan asked the fishermen about the flooded city. They pointed to the middle of the lake. There, on a clear day, you can see roofs, columns, streets, a city underwater, 3 meters deep, sometimes 4. It depends on the season. It's the end of summer now. The water is low, the perfect time. Dan asked for a boat. The fisherman provided one for a silver coin. A wide one, flat-bottomed, stable. The four of them set out. Dan rowed. Amber steered. Heyun sat in the bow, her face green from the rocking, staring into the water. Leah held the scrolls above the water with both hands. 20 minutes later, Dan saw the bottom. Stone slabs, paving stones, a street underwater, then walls, low, half-ruined, doorways clogged with silt. A column jutted out of the water like a finger. Lonely. The water was murky, but clear in places where the bottom hadn't been disturbed. Dan took out the disc. The dot glowed underwater. Deep down, beneath the buildings, beneath the foundations. The seal lay in the basement of one of the buildings. Dan pinpointed the location. A large building, a temple or a palace. Columns along the perimeter. Part of the roof was still standing. Under the roof, the water was greenish from algae. Dan took off his boots. He took off his shirt. He put the disc in his pants pocket. He tied the pocket with a rope so he wouldn't lose it. Amber said it was madness. Dan said that 3 meters of water wasn't crazy. He'd dived to 5 meters in the mountain lakes of Colorado. Amber said there were no flooded palaces with collapsed ceilings in the mountain lakes of Colorado. Dan jumped into the water, cold, murky near the bottom. He opened his eyes underwater. Visibility 2 meters. Enough. He dove. Stone walls all around. A doorway. A corridor. The ceiling low overhead. There was enough air. He was a good diver. 3 minutes without air. Training. Habit. He found a staircase. Down. Into the basement. He dove deeper. 4 meters. 5. Darker. Colder. He felt along the walls with his hands. A door. Stone. Locked. A disc on the door. Bronze. A compass rose. He pressed his disc against the door. Even underwater, the bronze grew warm. The door trembled. It shifted. He squeezed inside. A room. Small. A pedestal. An object on the pedestal. He grabbed it with his hand. Round. Bronze. Warm even underwater. The second seal. His lungs were burning. He pushed off the wall and swam upward. Through the door. Through the corridor. Up the stairs. He surfaced. He gasped for air. Circles swam before his eyes. The boat was 3 meters away. Amber leaned over the side and held out her hand. He grabbed it. She pulled him into the boat. He lay on the bottom among fish scales, clutching the seal in his hand. The second one. Heyun leaned over him, checked his pulse, his eyes, his breathing. Then she said he was an immortal idiot. Dan laughed. Lying on the bottom of the boat, wet and shivering from the cold, with a bronze sun in his hand. He laughed and couldn't stop, because it was madness. All of it. This whole world, this whole life. And he liked it. After Altaran, they turned east. According to Leah's calculations, the third seal was located in the foothills of the Kingdom of Velgard, the most dangerous territory. Cassian's land, the Order's land, the land of the confiscation decree. Amber was against it. For the first time ever, she wasn't just grumbling. She stood in front of Dan and said he was leading them to their deaths. Velgard isn't a mountain village. There's an army there. There's the Order there. There, every peasant would snitch for a copper coin. Dan listened. Then he pulled out a map. He pointed to a spot. The third seal wasn't in the city. Not in the fortress. In the mountains. In the foothills on the border between Velgard and the Drevlesk Principality. Disputed territory. No man's land. Patrols were rare. The population was sparse. Shepherds and goats. Amber looked at the map, then at Dan. Then she said she needed a raise. Double pay. Dan gave her 2 gold rings. She hid them and didn't thank him. The journey east took 10 days. They rode through the Drevel Principality, a small mountain state, poor, proud, at war with its neighbors over every pass. There were no seekers here. This place had its own problems. A pass. A border. War. They stopped for the night in a village, a small one, 10 houses. A girl was sitting by the well, alone, about 12 years old, dirty, skinny, with empty eyes. Haeyun approached her, asked where her parents were. The girl didn't answer. She stared at the ground. Haeyun sat down next to her, just sat down, silently. Half an hour later, the girl spoke. Her parents had died. A month ago, a landslide on the road. She was left alone. She lives with neighbors. The neighbors aren't mean, but they aren't kind either. She eats leftovers. She sleeps in a shed. Haeyun turned to Dan. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him. Dan sighed. Then he nodded. In the morning, the 5 of them left. The girl's name was Mira. She sat on a horse behind Haeyun and held onto her belt. She was silent, but her eyes were no longer empty. Something had appeared in them. Not hope, just a question for now. Maybe. Amber looked at Mira, then at Dan. Then she rode up to him and whispered that he was gathering an army of orphans. Dan said that one girl wasn't an army. Amber said, "Give it time." On the 7th day of their journey, they reached the foothills. The Velgard border lay half a day's journey to the east. Here the mountains were lower than the Gray Mountains, gentler, covered in forest to the peaks. Different rock. Dan read the slopes and saw sandstone. Red, soft, easily eroded. Karst cavities form faster in sandstone than in limestone. There must be many caves. The disk confirmed it. Golden dots flickered in all directions. Dan filtered them. Only Haldorian. The dots changed. Most went out. 3 remained. 1 far to the east, the 2nd below them, the 3rd, the brightest, in the mountain right in front of them. They tied their horses by the stream. They left Miru with Haeyun. Dan, Amber, and Leah headed toward the mountain. The cave entrance was easy to find. The sandstone was soft. Water had carved out the entrance over millennia. Wide, tall, unlined, natural. But 100 paces inside, nature gave way to human hands. The walls were hewn. The floor was leveled. There were inscriptions on the walls. Leah read as they went. Warnings. No entry. The Emperor's territory. Violators will be punished. Standard phrases for guarding tombs. Dan walked and counted his steps. At the 200th step, the corridor widened into a hall. Not as large as the library in the Gray Mountains, medium-sized, but in the center stood a sarcophagus. Stone. Massive. With a lid on which a figure was carved. A man in armor, with a sword across his chest, and a compass rose on his shield. Dan walked around the sarcophagus. On the far wall of the hall was a niche. In the niche, a pedestal. On the pedestal, the seal, the 3rd one. He took it. The world froze again. Emptiness. Silence. And a thought. Not a single word. More. You're faster than I thought. Dan stood in the void and listened to the voice of the dead emperor. Then the world returned. He stood with the seal in his hand. Leia looked at him. She asked what he had heard. Dan repeated it. You're faster than I thought. Leia took out a notebook and wrote it down. She wrote down every word from the emperor. She documented it. A historian to the core. On the way back from the cave, Dan noticed something. At the entrance to the sandy, fresh, boots, shod, military. He crouched down and looked. 4 pairs of tracks. They came from the east. They went back east. Recently. A few hours ago. Maybe this morning. Searchers. Or a border patrol. Or both. They were here. They saw the cave entrance. But they didn't go in. Why? Dan looked at the wall above the entrance. An inscription in Haldorian. A warning. The locals feared Haldorian curses. Even the Seekers were afraid. Superstition had saved the seal. But the tracks meant people were nearby, close, and they would return. They left immediately. Not east, south. Away from Velgard. Away from the tracks. Mira sat behind Haeyun and stared at the mountains with wide eyes. To her, it was all a mystery. She didn't yet understand that they were being hunted. After 2 days of fast riding, they stopped in a small valley between the hills, far from the roads, far from the villages. Safe, for now. 3 seals lay in Dan's bag. 3 out of 7.
Less than half, but progress. Leah spread out the map. The 4th seal on the islands, far away. They'd need a ship. The 5th in the capital of Velgard. Suicide. The 6th and 7th in places Leah still couldn't pinpoint. Dan looked at the map and thought, the islands, the enemy's capital, unknown locations. Every step harder than the last. Every step more dangerous. He put the map away. Said they needed one more person. Someone who knew Velgard from the inside. Someone who could lead them into the capital and get them out alive. Leah said she knew such a person. Or rather, she used to know. A woman. A former officer of the Order of Seekers. She left a year ago. Or was dismissed. Or deserted. Rumors vary. Her name is Marana Voss. Leah had met her in the Free Cities. Once. Briefly. Marana was drinking in a tavern and staring at the wall. There was a scar across her eyebrow. There was a weight on her shoulders that Leah recognized. The weight of a person who had done things they couldn't talk about. Dan listened. Then he asked where to find Marana. Leah said she was last seen in the port city of Callista, on the southern coast. You can also find a ship to the islands there. 2 things in one trip. Dan nodded. Callista, the port. Marana Voss, the ship. The 4th seal. They gathered their things and headed south. Callista greeted them with the smell of salt and rotting seaweed. A port city, large, noisy. Ships in the harbor. Warehouses along the waterfront. Taverns every 20 paces. It smelled of money and trouble in equal measure. Dan left Haeyun and Mira at an inn outside the city walls. Safer, quieter. Mira was already speaking. Not much, but she was speaking. Haeyun had taught her about herbs. The girl was a quick learner. The 3 of them went into the city. Dan, Amber, Leah. They found Marana Voss on the 3rd day. She was sitting in a tavern by the harbor, alone, with a mug of beer, dark-haired, with a scar across her left eyebrow, in plain clothes without insignia. But her posture gave her away. Back straight, shoulders squared, her eyes scanned the room every 30 seconds. A military habit. It never goes away. Leah approached first. Marana looked up. She recognized her. She wasn't pleased. She didn't tense up. She just looked. Leah sat down across from her. She introduced Dan. Amber. She explained briefly. They need help. Someone who knows Velgard. The Order. Cassiana. Marana listened in silence. She drank her beer. She didn't interrupt. When Leah finished, Marana set down her mug and asked one thing. Why did she need this? Dan sat down beside her. He took a medallion out of his pocket, the first one from the altar in Tilla's cave. He placed it on the table in front of her. Marana looked at the medallion. She picked it up. She turned it over in her hand. She saw the compass rose. Put it back. Said she wasn't interested in Haldor trinkets. She'd seen enough of them over the years of service. Dan nodded. Then he asked why she had left the order. Marana fell silent. For a long time, her fingers clenched the mug. Then she said that Cassian had ordered the village burned. Westholm, 30 houses, 120 people. Because the village elder refused to hand over a bronze bowl his grandson had found in the river. The bowl was worth 10 silver coins. The village was worth 120 lives. Marana stood and watched the houses burn. How the people were screaming. How her soldiers were driving the old people out into the cold. And at that moment, something inside her snapped. It didn't bend. It snapped. She took off her order insignia, laid it on the ground, and walked away.
Ever since, she's been drinking in the harbor taverns, not knowing why she lives. Dan listened. Then he said he had an answer to her question. Why? He told her. Not everything. Enough. The seals, the emperor, the compass, the fortress in the mountains, the people who came and stayed. Marana listened. Her face didn't change, but her eyes did, something deep inside, like embers under the ashes. When Dan finished, she was silent. A minute. 2. Then she said that if he was lying, she would kill him. Dan said he wasn't lying. Marana said she knew. She could tell when people were lying. Profession. The 4 of them left the inn. Marana carried only a sword and a shoulder bag, all her possessions, all that remained of her life in the order. A ship bound for the islands was found that same day. A merchant ship. It was heading to the eastern islands with a cargo of salt and cloth. The captain took the passengers for gold. He didn't ask why. Money doesn't ask questions. The voyage took 6 days. Dan had never been to sea, in either of his lives. For the first 2 days, he lay in his cabin and dreamed of death. Haeyun gave him mint tea and said it was a disgrace for a man who ventured into underground palaces. Mira sat next to him and silently stroked his hand. On the 3rd day, the rocking subsided and Dan went on deck. Islands appeared on the horizon on the 6th day. Green, mountainous, beautiful. Leah located the 4th seal on the largest island, in a temple atop a mountain, abandoned. The temple was Haldorian, built on volcanic rock. Dan studied the mountainside on the way up and marveled. Basalt columns, natural, hexagonal, like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. The Haldorians had built the temple right on top of them. They used the columns as a foundation. Brilliant. The temple was half ruined. The roof had collapsed. The walls still stood. The altar was intact. Beneath the altar, in a chamber sealed by the same bronze door with the compass rose, lay the 4th seal. Dan took it. The world froze. A voice, longer, clearer. 4 out of 7. You understand what will happen when you gather them all. Dan replied in his mind. No. The voice fell silent. The world returned. Dan stood with the 4th seal and thought about the question he hadn't asked. What would happen when he gathered all 7? The return journey by sea. 6 days again. Rocking again. Dan was lying down and suffering again. Haeyun didn't feel sorry for him anymore. She said that if he had survived the Manganese River and the flooded palace, he would survive a little swell. Marana turned out to be useful on the ship. She knew the sails, she knew the knots, she knew navigation. The merchant captain looked at her with respect. She worked silently and precisely, like a machine, without emotion. But one evening on deck, Dan saw her face in the light of the sunset. She was standing at the rail, looking at the water, and a tear was running down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it away quickly, but Dan saw it. When they returned to Callisto, Dan found something for Marana. The disc showed a location at the city cemetery. Small, dull, not gold, not silver. A bronze medallion. Military, engraved. Names. 6 names. Dan dug it out of the ground by an old grave and brought it to Marana. He placed it on the table in front of her at the tavern. Marana took it. She read the names. Her face froze. Then it broke. She pressed the medallion to her chest and closed her eyes. 6 names. Her first squad. Those she had lost in the service of the crown. Young. All young. They had died during the sweep of the Haldor tomb, which turned out to be a trap. She was the only one who survived, and ever since, she had carried them within her. Every day, every night, 6 ghosts on her shoulders. Now the ghosts had become names on bronze. Real. Tangible. and Marana could finally mourn them. She cried in the tavern without holding back. Amber silently placed a hand on her shoulder. Hayun brought tea. Leah turned away toward the window. Mira sat in the corner and watched. 12 years old, she already understood. She saw how Dan didn't find gold. He found what hurt and returned it to those to whom it belonged. The fifth seal lay in the capital of Velgard, the city of Velgard. 300,000 people, walls, a garrison, the Order of Seekers in full force. Cassian Vale in his office in the Citadel. Suicide. But Marana knew the city, knew every street, knew the guard schedules, knew the underground passages beneath the Citadel that the Order used for covert operations. She led them through, at night, through the sewers, through the basements, through a corridor that led to the old part of the city where the walls were Haldorian, because Velgard was built on the ruins of a Haldorian city, and beneath the Velgard citadel lay the Haldorian foundation, and beneath the foundation, a chamber with the seal. Dan found it using a compass. Marana neutralized 2 guards. No blood, chokeholds, professional, quiet. Amber stood watch. Leah read the inscriptions on the walls and whispered the translations. Hayun and Mira waited outside the city with the horses. The fifth seal lay in a chamber, beneath the basement, beneath the foundation. 3 levels down. Dan went down. He took the seal. The world froze. A voice. Clear. Close. Almost alive. 2 left. Listen to me, Dan. When you gather all 7, you will stand at a crossroads. One path is to revive the Empire. The second is to bury it forever. I won't tell you which is right, because I don't know. In 800 years, I still haven't figured it out. That's why I called you. The world returned. Dan stood in the darkness with the 5th seal. Tears streamed down his face. He didn't know why. Maybe because the voice sounded weary. 800 years of weariness in a single voice. They left Velgard before dawn. No one noticed. Marana led them back through the sewers and basements, and every step was precise. She knew this city better than her own hands. Leah had finally identified the 6th seal, an old monastery in the center of the mainland. Abandoned, at the crossroads of 4 roads. A place of power, a place of memory. It took them a week to get there. The monastery stood on a hill. The walls were crumbling. The roof had caved in, but the basements were intact. Haldorian, as always. The seal lay in the altar of the underground chapel. Dan took it. The world froze. A voice. The 6th. One remained. The last. The most important. It is where it all began. The world returned. Where it all began. Dan knew. Leah knew. Everyone knew. The flooded capital of Haldor, the city that sank beneath the earth on the moonless night. Somewhere on the mainland, beneath a layer of stone and clay, lay a dead city, and within it, the last seal. The disk showed the direction. North, far to the north, beyond the gray mountains, beyond everything they had ever seen. They traveled for 3 weeks across the entire mainland, from south to north, past cities, past villages, past patrols. Marana led the way. She knew the Order's routes, knew where the patrols were and when they changed shifts. They slipped through the net like water through fingers. Along the way, Dan stopped at a camp near the Gray Mountains. The people were safe. Gareth had built a new shelter. 23 people now. More had arrived. Caitlin was among them, the blacksmith girl from Tilla. She came alone, across half the continent, with a hammer on her belt. She found them through rumors. She stood before Dan and said she was coming with him. Dan looked at her. 17 years old, soot on her face, a stubborn chin. She reminded him of the intern from Colorado, the very one. who was right about the landslide. He said okay. Caitlin stayed at the camp with Gareth. She needed a forge, not a road. Gareth promised to build her a forge. They left Mira behind too. Haeyun hugged the girl. Mira didn't cry. She was no longer that vacant-eyed orphan by the well. She was part of something, for the first time in her life. The group headed north, 5 of them: Dan, Amber, Haeyun, Leah, Mirana. The journey to the flooded capital of Haldor took a week. The landscape changed. The hills became a plain. The plain became a swamp. The swamp became dead land. Nothing grew. The soil was gray, dead, like ashes. Dan read the rock and saw a catastrophe, not natural, magical, or geological on such a scale that the difference didn't matter. The ground here had sunk. An entire layer had dropped down, dozens of meters. The city had collapsed into a karst cavity, or the cavity had been created. Dan didn't know, but he saw the result: a plain with gray, dead soil. Beneath it, 40 meters deep, a dead city. The disk burned brighter than ever. Not just one dot, thousands. An entire city of golden dots underground, and one in the center, the brightest, the seal, the 7th, the last. Dan found the entrance, a hole in the ground, natural, formed by erosion. Over 800 years, water had carved a path downward, narrow, steep, but passable. He went down alone. Amber wanted to go. He said no, not this time. This was his path, his alone. She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes she couldn't put into words. She stood with her arms crossed, her lips trembling. Then she said that if he didn't come back, she would go down after him and kill him herself. Dan smiled. Then he looked at her for a long time and said one word: "Thank you." Amber turned away. He climbed down, 40 meters along the rope, into the darkness. At the bottom of a chasm was a city, dead, white stone, the very one from the dream. The towers had collapsed, the squares were buried, but the walls stood, and the streets were still there, a ghost town beneath the earth. Dan walked its streets with a torch and a disc, and saw what the Emperor had seen in his final hour: houses, temples, libraries, squares, fountains without water, statues without faces, everything white. Everything was stone. Everything was dead. The seal lay in the center, in the palace's throne room, on the throne. A bronze disc the size of a shield. Dan approached. He stood before the throne. He reached out his hand. The world froze. But not like before. Not darkness. Light. White light. And standing in the light was a man. Tall, in simple clothes, without a crown, without armor, with a tired and kind face. Emperor Haldor. He looked at Dan and smiled. Then he spoke. Not a single word, full sentences. He said, "Thank you for not being like them." He said that over 800 years, many had found the disc. Warriors, kings, scholars, everyone wanted to possess it. Everyone wanted to take it. Dan was the first who wanted to return it. Return things to the people. Return names to the dead. Return memories to the living. He said that now the choice was Dan's. The 7 seals. Together, they are the key. You can open the palace, raise the city, revive the empire. Or you can close it. Forever. Bury Haldor. Let him go. Let the ghosts go. Let the emperor himself go. Dan stood in the white light and looked at the man who had waited 800 years. Then he said that the empire kills people. Not by itself. Its legacy. Its gold. Its relics. People kill each other for bronze coins, burn villages for a chalice, hang old men for a ring. The empire must die, but knowledge must live on. Books, maps, blueprints, science, geology, medicine, everything the Haldors knew, all of this must return to the people, not to kings, to the people, to temples, to libraries, into the hands of those who will teach and heal. The emperor was silent. Then he smiled, wider, warmer, and said one word, yes. The light went out. Dan stood in the throne room with the seventh seal in his hands. 7 of them, all of them. He laid them on the floor before the throne. 7 bronze sun discs. They flared up. Golden light filled the hall, then the city. Then it faded, quietly, like an exhalation. When the light faded, the seals were different, dull, cold, ordinary bronze. The power was gone. Haldor was gone. The disc in Dan's hand had cooled. For the first time in all these months, the bronze was cold, dead. The emperor was gone, finally. Dan stood alone in the dead city underground with a cold disc in his hand, and he smiled. The ascent took an hour. 4 women were waiting on the surface. Amber saw him first. She headed to the edge of the shaft. He climbed out, wet, dirty, tired, with an empty bag and a cold disc. Amber looked at his face, then at the bag, then back at his face. She asked where the seals were. Dan said they were in place, where they were supposed to be. Amber didn't understand. Then she did. Then she stood there, looking at him without saying a word. Haeyun approached. She touched his forehead, his pulse. She said he was alive, and that was good enough. Leah took out a notebook and asked what the emperor had said. Dan told her. Leah wrote and cried. Marana stood to the side with her arms crossed, smiling barely noticeably. They drove home, to the gray mountains, to the fortress, to the people. The journey took 10 days. Dan rode in silence. He was thinking. The empire is buried. The seals have been broken, but the knowledge remains. The library in the mines of Upper Crag, scrolls, books, maps. Leah will translate everything. Haeyun will put her medical knowledge to use. Caitlin will forge weapons based on the Haldorian blueprints. Marana will teach them how to defend themselves. Amber will lead caravans, carrying books along safe trails. Everything will fall into place. Not in a day, over the years, but it will. When they rode up to the new camp near the Gray Mountains, 23 people were waiting for them. Gareth, a carpenter with his family. Miners. Caitlin in a leather apron with a hammer. Mira, who had grown 2 centimeters over the past few weeks. A woman whose bruises had long since healed. Her daughter. Others. Those who had come. Those who had stayed. Those who had believed. Caitlin saw Dan first. She rushed to him and threw her arms around his neck. He staggered. She was heavier than she looked. The miners smiled. The carpenter waved. The children shouted. Mira stood and watched with serious eyes. Amber dismounted. She stood with her arms crossed. She looked at Dan, at the people, at the fortress behind them. Gareth had managed to finish the 2nd level. The roof was up, new, wooden, sturdy. Amber spoke quietly so that only Dan could hear. "You're late for dinner, you idiot." Dan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the mountains. Her cheeks were red. He smiled. Then he took a disc out of his pocket. Cold, dead, ordinary bronze. He placed it in his palm. And the disc did the last thing it brick. A map appeared on its surface. Not gold, silver, silent. A map of the fortress, the courtyard, and points glowed on the map. 6. No, not 6. More. 23. Every person, every soul, everyone who had been here, and one point among them, his. Dan stood with the disc in his hand and looked at the map of his home, at the dots of his people, and he realized he had found what he was looking for. Not the seals, not gold, not glory. Home. The disc cooled completely. The map went dark, the bronze became just bronze. The emperor was gone. But home remained, and the people remained, and the mountains stood all around. And Dan Marchetti, a dead geologist from Colorado, stood among the living people who were his family and knew that he was finally home.